across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This
Oh, man alive, lots to get through this afternoon. Thank you to Alex Phillips. Welcome to the home of common sense. You really are going to get a healthy dose of common sense here this afternoon. What have we got? Well, of course, that COVID inquiry has concluded that lockdowns could have been avoided entirely during the pandemic if ministers had reacted quicker to the emerging threat of the virus. It was a culture of flipping chaos, says the report. We'll look into that in a little bit more detail. How has lockdown affected your life? I mean, all these years later, a few years on. Just give us an overview of where you're at on this and what it did to you. Also this afternoon, migrants are set to get a big increase on the £3,000 voluntary return scheme. This is as Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood looks to crack down on the migrant benefit bill here in the UK. She's noted that it is better value than letting people stay. Is she onto something? Many would not unreasonably argue, why should we pay anything in this respect? And here we go. Wealthier areas in the UK could face uncapped council tax rises. This is going to be interesting as funding is cut and redirected to poorer towns, often more disproportionately so in the north. This is Labour's Fair Funding Review. Wealthier, lower tax councils in financial difficulty may be allowed to raise bills beyond the current cap, which of course is set at 5%. We'll have more on all of those stories and, of course, important to hear from you. On that lockdown issue, how has it affected your life? COVID, the inquiry. Well, there is a lot to wade through here. Where do we start? I'll tell you where we start. I'll tell you exactly where we start on this, with an acute reminder of just how dark and sinister-like that whole era was. Have a listen.
This is a vital update about coronavirus.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
To stay at home.
Stay as Secretary of State for Health and Social Care.
Stay alert. Control the virus. Save lives.
Wow. I mean, it was grim, right? I mean, every shade of grim. You almost have to try not to think about that era. We even had cops wandering around the place with megaphones. Remember this?
Guys, you can't stay on the green. Can you all go home? Can you all go home, please? It's not a holiday. It's a lockdown, which means you don't just come in and sunbathe. Can you please just leave?
He's back. Megaphone cop has returned. We haven't played that clip for, well, literally years. That's what it was like. People getting fined for having a walk with a... there was a couple, wasn't there? They were having a walk, and because they had two cups of coffee in their hand, it was seen as not part of their daily exercise, but it was seen as recreational. And because it was recreational, I think they were fined like 50 quid for being wrong-uns. Because they couldn't, probably, if it's recreational, you wouldn't have a coffee in your hand. Well, I can take a coffee and no, it was like that. And now, of course, we have a report. This is only part of 3 COVID reports. This is just the middle one. And there seems to be a lot of predictions here. I won't pretend that I've made full sense of all of this, so your help would be appreciated. This report costs over 2 million quid. Part 2 out now. It's a must-read, kids. Forget Plato, Shakespeare or J.K. Rowling. If you haven't read Baroness Hallett's report, she's the chairman of the committee, by the way, of the inquiry, you are nothing in the world of knowledge and enlightenment. This is a rip-roaring read, and because I do this for a living, I decided I would give it a go. Oh, yes. 5 beers and a pack of Marlboro Lights later, I thought I was done. And then I got to page 2. There's 800 of these pages, by the way, and it is a mess. We can all agree on that. The noble Baroness, I mean, come on, she's a diligent sort, and I'm sure she had a tough old gig, but there is an array of confusion in all of this. If we'd had lockdown earlier, we could have saved 23,000 lives. But that's according to modelling by our friend Professor Neil Ferguson, another godlike character in the world of stats, apparently. Although some say he's about as welcome as measles. His critics can be less kind. Hallett suggests we might not have needed a lockdown at all if we'd have got to grips with things early doors. Too little, too late seems to be the mantra of the day. She said Boris Johnson oversaw a toxic and chaotic culture in number 10 during COVID. We should have got stuff done sooner. I mean, that bit is probably true. People need to use their noggin, and if they'd done that, we'd have been better off. For example, there was, of course, a big football match, if you remember, Atletico Madrid and Liverpool. 3,000 Atletico fans travelled from Madrid, which was already, by the way, a COVID-19 hotspot, to be met with 52,000 Brits, all in one, so 54,000 in total, in one stadium. And then there was Cheltenham on top of that. There was all sorts of stuff. People often say, well, look at Sweden, that's the example. I mean, it's fair to say there is a slightly cultural differences. So it's a smaller place, obviously. It's not an international hub as this country is. We didn't do enough with the airports and stuff like that. So had we got to grips with it, because we all saw the carnage unfolding in Italy, right? That was the sort of sobering reminder of what might be to come, and these horrendous stories where parts of Italy had this really bad. And of course we didn't, and then it got out of control, and then, you know, there were people, and of course, you know, let's not pretend here, whilst we can say, yes, we should have had a very different approach to lockdown, even if I think we can fairly safely argue probably didn't need them at all. There would have been other ways of doing this. But it was very real, and people did die with COVID, people who might not have died otherwise had they got COVID. It wasn't just a cold, it wasn't just a bit of flu, it was something that's far more virulent, and it was, to those in a vulnerable position, it was far more devastating. So they are facts of the matter. That doesn't mean to say that we therefore agree with things like lockdown, and we don't question the efficacy of masks and all that went with it. 0344 499 1000. What I want to ask here, because this was the most curious thing to me. We have this lockdown thing, and I've told this story so many times. I remember being in the queue on outside my little boy's school on the school run, and people were talking about it. I think France had just declared a lockdown. I remember listening to a couple of other parents saying, well, it's not going to happen here, is it? One said it might do. I think it might. Yeah, I think we're going to lock down. I genuinely thought it was the most preposterous thing I'd ever heard. I was like, really? We're going to lock down? And of course we did. And we locked down big. And it was pubs, and it was hairdressers, and it was businesses. It was gyms. It was everything you can imagine. And most curiously, hospitals. Yes, we pretty much locked down healthcare during a health emergency. I mean, you can't write this stuff. There was panic and there was chaos, of course. And the devastation of the lockdown goes from, and of course we closed schools, goes from small children, and I would imagine many of those kids are sort of somewhat underdeveloped, socially if nothing else. Some will be a little scarred by the idea that in their formative, those tiny years, being 4, 5, 6, they were locked up in a house, or, you know, if they lived in a flat, then the situation, of course, became even more intolerable. So there was all of that going on with kids. People who lost their businesses during that time and never really recovered. The cost of things that then increased due to global shortages. The fact you couldn't go to the tip and get rid of I mean, the list is kind of endless, and you have to almost try to, you know, when they say if you've had a bad car crash, you sometimes don't remember it, and it's the kind of the brain's way of saving you from further trauma. You've already got a broken leg and a gammy left cheek, so the last thing you want to do is remember the finer details of when that car crashed into yours or something. And I think it's similar with this. I think there's a bit of you that kind of doesn't quite want to remember how horrific it was. When you did have to visit the shops, because you were just about allowed to do that, as long as you followed the footprints that the Tesco and the Sainsbury's boys had lobbed on the floor for. As long as you did that, then you could kind of go shopping. But you remember how quiet the roads were. And when I did get back to coming into work, because I could work, I'd be the only person on a 12-carriage train. It was eerie, and it was weird, it was bizarre, and it was flipping awful. So how did it affect you? Genuine question. How did lockdown affect you, and does it continue to do so? 0344 499 1000. Give us the human face of what this has done to our country. Let's get a word on this and the other big stories of the day. We have James Price with us, former government senior special advisor. James, good afternoon to you.
Well, good afternoon, except for having to relive and recall all the horrors of lockdown, as you did very well there. I'm just glad that we've got it in the rearview mirror and that we'll hopefully never in our own lifetimes go back to anything so cruel and inhuman again.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's only when you start to sort of think about it, you think, wow, yeah, I remember looking at that. No one was there. There was no one on the roads. It was bizarre. It was almost like when I was a kid, you know how boring Sundays were as a kid when you had to go, because nothing really happened. It was like every day was a perpetual Sunday in the 1980s, and that's slightly before your time, James, but you take the point.
Except, of course, you weren't even allowed to go to church, were you, in lockdown?
You couldn't even do that. You couldn't even pray for recovery. I mean, that was how bad it was. Let's have a listen then to Baroness Hallett. She's the chair of the inquiry. Here's what she's had to say.
Failure to lock down earlier may have cost lives. Had the lockdown been imposed 1 week earlier than the 23rd of March, the evidence suggests that the number of deaths in England alone in the first wave up until the 1st of July 2020 would have been reduced by 48%. That is approximately 23,000 fewer deaths.
That's one part of it, James. She does also suggest we might not have needed lockdown at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very, very sceptical of this idea that we would be able to know from numbers like that and litigate on policy decisions made in the heat of the moment and say, oh, well, as a result, these people, because they were a bit chaotic, are responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. I think that's pretty ghoulish, and I think that's a very poor way of doing this. And I don't think we certainly should have spent, 200 million quid's worth of taxpayers' money to say something quite like this. I think a lot of it is saying things that people already knew, which was if we were more organised and had a better plan ahead of time, then we would be more organised, which is a sort of piece of circular logic, but is true. And I also think there's a big difference between what we knew in the first lockdown, going into the first lockdown, and the second and the third and then the fourth one that didn't actually happen. I was actually in government during a lot of this, especially in that first moment, and people didn't have a huge amount of information. We didn't know really what was coming out of China. They were being very obfuscatory, very difficult about things. You had scientists coming and saying to the politicians, you've got to do this or all these people will die. Numbers being banded around like 500,000 people in the first wave and all this sort of stuff. They were only really thinking about the NHS, not even other healthcare conditions, certainly not young people, not the economy or the long-term impact that having a weakened economy would have on people's health and well-being and all the rest of it. So, at the very least, I think that we should give people a bit more credit in that first lockdown and then a lot less credit for the fact that we were doing it again and so cack-handedly.
Yeah, we keep going to, I mean, Sweden always seems to be the example of what we should have done. It's interesting, one point I did forget to mention, but Gary on X has brilliantly reminded me, and that is that Sweden did have higher death rates than its Scandinavian neighbours, Denmark and Norway. And of course, this wasn't the Swedish leadership saying, yeah, we don't believe all this old nonsense, so here you go and do your own thing. That wasn't the spirit with which they executed their own plan. Sweden is a slightly different animal. The people's relationship with government and health departments is very different. There's a very big sense of sort of personalised responsibility that is sort of different even to their neighbouring countries. So it's not a complete go-to example, but it does perhaps illuminate maybe we could have done a bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely right. And of course, in the first instance, we were doing that. That was part of the plan.
Yeah.
That then some various hysterical people on the left, largely, and I suppose I would say it was people on the left's fault, were calling to push down harder and totally change the plan, which is, always dangerous. You're always injecting risk if you change a plan halfway through enacting something. Because we used to have a higher level of personal responsibility towards our fellow Britons for a very long time through most of our history. I can't help but think that if COVID had come along in the 1980s, then perhaps things might have been a little bit different and we would have been more voluntarily kind and caring towards one another. I certainly remember certain bits of selfish behaviour, people obviously being sick, just wandering around and all the rest of it in those early stages. But by and large, in that time just before the mandatory lockdown lockdown came in, people did choose to modify their behaviour, stop going and seeing elderly relatives or friends, be a bit more careful, stop going out and about, and being a little bit more sensible. I certainly think that the kind of infantilization that we ended up having, and you used some amazing examples just there, police officers going around screaming at people in loud hailers. The local park near me had some pull-up climbing frames, and they took the horizontal bar away so that you couldn't go out and exercise, as if that was a way of making people healthier. Mad stuff like that. That we should never have got into that business, and we should never, by the way, have got into the business of the sort of curtain twitching of trying to snitch on your friends. I think that's caused...
Yeah, that was always... I remember having a row with a woman on a train about mask wearing, and she was very grumpy that I didn't have it put on properly. We had all of that stuff, you know. I might as well have just killed her dog for the reaction that she had to me. It was extraordinary. Just give us briefly, if you would, on this, James, a little overview then of that sense of what Downing Street was like. I mean, I know Dominic Cummings has talked about this a lot as well. He sort of, to paraphrase, he talks about also a lot of chaos. You know, you had the SAGE committee over there saying one thing, and you had other people, you know, all sorts of opinions roaming around the place. Obviously, I don't envy the job of the Prime Minister at the time, because you're the one that's got to come to the conclusion of which way you're going to take it. But does that sense of chaos, and I think the phrase she used, that it was chaotic and toxic.
Well, that often describes lots of Downing Streets, including the one that we've got at the moment with Keir Starmer squatting in it.
True.
I think if we recall our minds back, we just had that bruising general election campaign. Everybody was knackered, people were new in their jobs, and then suddenly this thing comes along whilst everybody's head was in Brexit and what you're going to do for the next 5 years of the Parliament and all the rest of it. Not to excuse any of it, but just to try and give people a sense that this thing came totally out of left field. And you had a civil service who had said beforehand, don't worry, we are the most prepared government anywhere in the world. We've got all the best plans and all the rest of it. Of course, that was based around an influenza-style pandemic and not something like this. So already there was a problem. You've got this guy, Chris Wormold, who is now the Cabinet Secretary, the most powerful civil servant in the country, possibly the most powerful person in the country, who at the time was running the Department for Health and has come into a lot of criticism on this as well. He was advocating people just went around having chickenpox parties so everyone can go and get it, which not seem terribly smart, when the big problem would have been lots of people getting ill in that first spike all at the same time.
Sure.
But a lot of idiocy going around in the civil servants as well. You've got politicians whose job is not to be an expert on something. Boris Johnson was not elected to be an epidemiologist or an expert. But when you've got the epidemiologists coming in and going, right, it's all going to be terrible, everyone's going to die unless you do all of this, yada, yada, they're able, therefore, to squeeze out all the other people, like the economists, like the children's developmental specialists, because you're focusing only on this one issue. And what we've seen from a really long tail now, and I'm sat opposite the Department for Education where I worked during the Omicron epidemic spike as well, is an awful lot of problems for young people in schools, people before that and their own development. And none of that stuff, nor the massive amount of borrowing, huge amount of borrowing that is still crippling the economy that we made at the time, none of that stuff was factored in early doors. And that's what politicians are supposed to do. They're supposed to balance the different competing issues, and I don't think that happened because the scientists were able to scare everybody so much.
Yeah, that's spot on. James, stay with us. Lots more still to discuss. James Price, former government special advisor, with us on the programme, as he said he was there in Downing Street for some of this reaction that Number 10 and others were trying to cobble together some kind of common sense, and it appears getting it horribly wrong on quite a big chunk of it. I want your thoughts on this, just how it kind of, like the real coalface of the problem. People, tax-paying Brits sitting at home, Brits who were told, actually, you can't go out, some couldn't go to work, losing your business, your kids not being able to go to school, and everything that goes with it. And the most criminal element of this was pretty much closing down hospitals to anything other than flipping COVID. 0344 499 1000. This is Talk. Big news coming this December. Our talkTV app is moving to the Talk app. You can watch, catch up and listen to all your favourite shows and podcasts anytime, anywhere, all on the Talk app. From Monday, 1st of December, the talkTV app will no longer exist, so don't miss out. So head over to your App Store or Google Play and search Talk now.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
Here's a good example of exactly what we're talking about in terms of, how did lockdown affect you? This comes from John in Blackpool. During lockdown, John was attacked by burglars who snapped the tendon in his arm. Now, of course, ordinarily, if that happened, not only are you dealing with the burglary and the trauma and the shock of what the hell has happened, you'd nip down the hospital and get it sorted. Unfortunately, because we were in lockdown, it took over a year, he says, for me to get treatment, by which time the tendon was irreparable. I'm left partly disabled due to this now. John, I'm sorry to hear that, mate, but it is an absolute, almost typical example of what is likely to happen if you close down essential services during a health emergency. Yeah, that's what we did. Don't go to hospital, don't put the pressure on the NHS. And you end up with, and I think there are thousands of people, tens of thousands like John, and it can get even more, not that being partly disabled isn't bad enough, but people who, miss cancer screenings and goodness knows what else. Horrendous times. James Price is with us, former government senior special advisor. Let's move on to this story. James, the Home Office rarely out the news, of course, particularly at the moment. The new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, making some real waves in the immigration debate in the last few days, and now planning big increases in the 3,000 quid that is often given to those who come to this country to get them to return home. This is to go back voluntarily. It's a pilot scheme modelled on the Danish system that can offer over £20,000 to failed asylum seekers and foreign offenders. She says it actually sounds a lot of money, but when you crunch the numbers, it's better value than those people remaining here. Let's have a listen to her just the other day in the House of Commons.
The burden that has fallen on this country has been heavy. 400,000 have sought asylum here in the last 4 years. Over 100,000 people now live in asylum accommodation, and over half of refugees remain on benefits 8 years after they have arrived. To the British public who foot the bill, the system feels out of control and unfair. It feels that way because it is. The pace and scale of change has destabilised communities. It is making our country a more divided place.
A more divided place, the Home Secretary speaking this week in the House of Commons. James, 20,000 quid is a lot of money. The headlines for that would be horrific, wouldn't they? But her point is it's actually costing more to keep those people here. Yeah,
it is a huge headline figure, but we're talking about on a budget the government has of, what is it spending, 1.4 trillion pounds or something.
Yeah.
If the calculations can be proven to be right, that it does save money. And I think the other crucial bit is that you're not having people then taking that money, getting a flight home, seeing their family, and then making their way back again, as we've seen several people under the so-called one-in, one-out scheme do, coming through the kind of revolving door. If you can prove that, then actually I think I would have a lot of sympathy for it. But there's a big but in there, that actually getting the border to be tightened up in the first place is something that would be actually very easy to do in terms of the physical efforts of it.
Yeah.
But will the lawyers let Shabana Mahmood actually tighten up that border? I don't think so.
I don't think so either, and there's the problem. We will, it's not going to be dull over there at the Home Office, as you say. It very rarely is. And then there is this story as well. That is council tax and trying to manage that old thing. Affluent areas could face uncapped rises as funding is cut and redirected to poorer areas. Those areas are often in the north. This is under Labour's Fair Funding Review. Let's have a listen to what the Labour Party said about their refusal to raise council tax.
I'm determined to put money back in the pockets of working people. And that's why a Labour government would freeze council tax this year. No ifs, no buts.
Labour would freeze council tax next year. We're going to freeze council tax next year.
You could rip up that council tax bill because you would not pay a penny more than you paid last year.
Yes, you heard it right. Not a penny more on your council tax.
None of those pledges in our manifesto requires increases in council tax.
No, we're not planning to reform council tax.
That is what we would do in government.
Is he going to do what a Labour government would do and announce an immediate freeze in council tax bills?
We're often asked the question, when you criticise the government, what would you do? Well, we're saying what we would do. We would freeze council tax.
I won't raise council tax. He's not going to do it, James. Apart from one problem, he is.
How do you know a politician is lying? Their lips are moving. But this is a particularly egregious example of it, isn't it? Look, what does the Bible say? As the dog returneth to its vomit, so the fool returneth to his folly, and Labour returneth to lying and raising your taxes. It's always going to happen.
Love that.
All they know how to do. They can't reduce wasteful spending. They don't understand business enough to want to get growth going. So all they'll do is tax more. And the cheek of the man to say, I want to put money back in hard-working people's pockets. Well, it's all very well and good until you're taking it out of someone else's pocket to shove it in. This kind of redistribution has to be done to some very small extent for people who really suffer. There's a safety net for people, those who can't look after themselves, and nobody begrudges that. But when you start getting to the kind of wide-scale redistribution that socialists and communists all want to do, it never ends well. You'll just see more rich people leaving, more people giving up, more people not being able to afford those bills, and therefore they'll become recipients as well. And you follow this horrendous, vicious cycle all the way down into destitution and poverty. I'm sorry to be so miserable.
But also,
Friday.
this kind of sort of Barnett-esque formula of looking at how they raise council tax. I mean, it's completely flawed. I mean, the idea that, anyone south of Birmingham is some sort of multi-millionaire. These are the kind of urban myths that the likes of Andy Burnham dine out on a daily basis, telling Mancunians they've got it great going on down there. The poorest parts of this country are in London. That's never really mentioned. I live in Kent, and the idea that Kent, the Garden of England, it's got some nice castles and all that kind of caper, and Gloria Hunniford lives near me, so I've got all of that going on. But the idea that there aren't people struggling is an absolute nonsense. So it's all very well saying we're going to put it to northern towns. They've got to think very, very hard on this one. And of course, more fundamentally, it will be another massive break in a promise, a long line of them that Keir Starmer and others have come up with. Listen, James, we hit the clock on that point. Have a great weekend. Great to have you with us, James Price. He's a former government senior special advisor. We're going to talk more on the issue of COVID and that big inquiry part 2. We've got Professor Simon Wood, statistician, coming on with us. Will Jones from the Daily Skeptic's going to be here. And Dr. Chris Smith, the consultant virologist, will be joining us too to chew the fat over this report, what it means, what we should have done, where we got it wrong. I'm asking you, very simply, how has lockdown affected your life? Either at the time or all these years later, are you still got the legacy? Not long COVID in that sense, but long effects of lockdown in that sense. Lines are open. This is Talk.
across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
The madness of lockdown and what it did to you is a couple of great points on this. Kaz in Bedford says, I realised we totally lost the plot when we reached the moment of peak COVID madness. Trying to declare whether a Scotch egg was deemed a snack or a meal. I'd forgotten about the Scotch egg. That was absolutely insane. No, you can't. That doesn't count. That doesn't count. You're not having a meal. You're having a snack. No, it's a meal. Is it a meal? Is it a snack? But on a more profound and very serious and just breathtakingly sad note, Ashley says, and there are many people sadly in this position, Ashley says, it still affects me because of the guilt I feel to this day having to leave my mum dying of cancer alone in a hospital. We will never forget it. And you would never forget that. The person that raised you, the person that loved you, the person that gave you direction and support. And when that ultimate time came that they were going to move to their next chapter of their existence, then they're on their own. Was that the best we could do? Seriously, Ashley, thank you for that. The UK COVID inquiry has said, and this is the latest instalment of that inquiry, that lockdowns could have been avoided if ministers had imposed stringent measures before March 2020. Contact tracing, self-isolation, masks, hygiene, that kind of thing. However, a toxic and chaotic culture in Downing Street led to late, inadequate responses that made lockdown inevitable. Let's remind ourselves, and this is, I almost feel like giving a trigger warning on this, a sobering reminder of how dark those days were.
This is a vital update about coronavirus.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
To stay at home. Stay at home.
Stay at home, protect
Control the virus. Save lives.
Yeah. And they were awful times. We can all, whatever intricacies of your argument are on the wider issue, we would all agree we don't want to go through that again. Let's firstly speak with Professor Simon Wood, statistician from the University of Edinburgh. Simon, good afternoon to you, sir. Hi. Nice to have you with us. Can you hear us okay, Simon?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, we can hear you now. Fantastic. I mean, as a statistician, I can't remember what percentage of the population are statisticians, but nonetheless, it is one of those jobs. Yeah, I know, I went there. It is one of those jobs, isn't it, that you find that constant argument about, which set of stats you believe and which ones you don't. There's always a good, healthy dose of confirmation bias in how we read and digest information, especially with something as controversial as this. But I know you're a very well-respected, objective man in this field. So give us an overview, firstly, having looked at this over the years and all the various elements to it. What was your take on the big headlines that we heard from Baroness Hallett on her conclusions?
Well, I think there were some things to like there. Obviously it's a 750-page report. These are very superficial impressions on having read what I can since yesterday. There are some things to like there. I mean, I think it's just true that the initial response was very sluggish. It would have been much better if it was much quicker. It would have been much better if we had started measuring the extent of infection much earlier with something like the ONS survey, that really knowing how many people are infected is crucial. And you need measurements to do that. So I think that's good. There are other things in the report that, they're just completely right, that there's almost a complete absence of health economics in the management process. They mention that. They mention the absence of any kind of economic equivalent to SAGE. Yeah. And again, that seems really disturbing in a country like the UK, where we know that the knock-on health effects of economic deprivation are really big. And if you exacerbate economic deprivation, you're likely to shorten people's lives. So, I think some things there in the report are really, really good. It's also in places very good on the limitations of models. So all of that's very positive. I was a little bit more surprised, I suppose, by the very firm statement that 23,000 lives would have been saved if we'd locked down a week earlier, right? And there, I think you've just departed completely from the science. I don't think you can say that scientifically. I think it's putting far too much credence in models that were never designed for the purpose of answering this question and were never tested for that purpose.
Indeed, and I'm not a statistician, I'm not a scientist, but I also drew that same conclusion when I looked at that aspect, and I was aware of how this modelling had previously been used, and it felt misapplied in this respect.
I think that's right. I think it's been somewhat oversold, and I think good people doing the modelling, and they were trying to do their best, but there is a bit of a culture in that community of somewhat overselling your results, and that's fine in a scientific journal where you're perhaps pushing it a bit, but when you're locking down the whole country on that basis, it becomes more problematic, I think.
I mean, this was a huge, complex, labyrinthine area. I know it's very easy to talk to your mate in the pub, and your mate goes, we don't need a lockdown, we just get on with it. And I remember Boris Johnson at the time being on daytime TV talking about how there is a school of thought that you just let this thing go through the nation, and it's a bit rough for a few weeks, but then it disappears. And I mean, some people do still believe all of that. If you talk to somebody, it's interesting, given what you do for a living, Simon, you might be able to illuminate me a little on this. If you talk to people in France or Germany, I'm pretty sure there's probably a phone-in going on right now, where they're saying similar things. Our government should have done this, they never did that, they locked us down, they should have, we could have saved lives here or saved lives there. It's not really exclusive to this country, is it? I mean, the whole thing, by definition, was chaotic.
Well, I think that's right, but I mean, you do have to look at places like Sweden, where the regulatory framework meant that they simply could not do the kind of thing that was done here in a panic. It had to be left to epidemiologists. They weren't allowed to kind of shut down the whole country. Bit of a more measured approach. I think not a noticeably worse outcome, certainly relative to the UK, a substantially better outcome.
What was their thinking? Are you aware of what their thinking was there? Because I don't think this was full of sort of COVID deniers who were going, this is all BS, so go out there and drink as much as you like and go to as many football matches as you like. It wasn't that. So what was their kind of thinking behind their approach?
That it had to be sustainable. I mean, that the Anders Tegnell thing is this has to be sustainable in the long term. We're sitting here at the beginning of something that's going to go on for a long time. We don't have a vaccine. We don't even know whether we're going to get a vaccine. Right? And so the measures that you take have to be sustainable. And I think that's an aspect that perhaps just didn't feature sufficiently in the UK thinking about all this.
So we should have looked really at vulnerable people and said, OK, care home situations, that's clearly where we look after people, and isolation might be the wisest approach. But, kids wearing masks, getting isolated, was that really necessary?
Well, no. I mean, I think what was done to school children was very unfortunate. I mean, it was partly, I think, because what the modelers were used to doing was to think about influenza, flu, where school children are really the drivers of it, and that turned out just not to be the case with COVID. It wasn't school kids; they were, they weren't passing on very much. They weren't getting sick. A very, very different situation. Now, fair enough, it was difficult to know that immediately, but some bits of the evidence were there very, very early.
Indeed. Simon, listen, thank you for your time, sir. We will speak again, I'm sure. Professor Simon Wood, statistician from the University of Edinburgh. Let's speak with Will Jones, editor of the Daily Sceptic. I can remember Will being on a train during all of this time and talking to a fella. I think he was a barrister, as I remember, and he was very, very animated about what was going on in our world. He mentioned the Daily Sceptic at the time and said, that go there, check out what these guys are writing about, because you will get perhaps in his view, a more honest approach to things. It won't be slanted by sort of weird science and odd political decisions. And you guys were very forthright on this narrative. You didn't let it go rightly, so I'm bound to ask you, Will, what is your analysis of Baroness Hallett and her inquiry report?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Ian. There are some positives in this new report, the Module 2 report from the COVID inquiry. We've got this acknowledgement that SAGE was too much taken over by groupthink, and the government as well, and there needs to be more diverse voices. That's good. We needed more critical, sceptical voices on the scientific advisors. Excellent. And there was an acknowledgement, there's a lot of acknowledgement of the harm of school closures and a lot of the other harms of lockdown, and really pointing out how damaging those things were. That was good. And as Simon mentioned, the need for much more economic analysis and risk assessment of the lockdowns. There just wasn't any of that. And all we had was this science, this health-based, safety-ist science, supposed science saying that we need to lock everyone down to stop the spread of this highly contagious disease because that's the only thing that's important. No analysis of what the wider impacts will be. Hallett said that we need that. That's good. So we've got some good things there that could form the basis of some better decision making next time. But, and you knew there's going to be a but coming, overall, it's a pretty disastrous report, I have to say, for one major reason, and that's that it still affirms this principle that lockdown is something that is desirable, that it is feasible to try to suppress a virus, to stop a respiratory virus, highly contagious airborne respiratory virus from spreading, from reaching everyone it's going to reach. That's possible, that it's feasible, and that it's overall worthwhile and beneficial, all things considered. It still holds to that. This report criticises the government for not locking down sooner. It criticises the government for not doing more circuit breaker lockdowns. It criticises the government, even criticises the government for not locking down in the end of 2021 when Omicron arrived. Even though the fact that we didn't lock down and there was no disaster and it was clearly the right decision.
Yeah.
Hallett still criticised the government for that because she says the government was not entitled to take that risk. It should have taken what was supposedly the safer option. So that's the kind of fantasyland and lockdown belief in what I think of as a lockdown religion, if you like, that this report has. And so it's really disappointing for that.
Yeah. I was going to say, well, somebody once said that lockdown is a stupid person's idea of what they think an intelligent response to a pandemic is. Because in the advent of panic and having no clue and not wanting to put your name on the tin, and there was, rumblings that Boris Johnson wasn't pro-lockdown, but someone got to him or whatever happened, it does feel like a little bit of groupthink going on, because other countries had done it, along with the absence of any good, stable idea of what to do. So if in doubt, just lock the place down.
And yet, the fact is that we did have pandemic plans. We had a pandemic plan that had been in place for years. And that pandemic plan, developed with sound science, was very clear. It said that we will not be locking down the country. We will not be closing businesses under any circumstances. We will not be stopping large gatherings. We will not be closing schools. All the things that we did in the panic, the plan that we actually did have, and the report does not say anything near enough about this and the positives of these plans, were very clear. And the reason for that is clear because it was known pre-COVID, it was known that these things were not going to be effective. You can't suppress a virus out of existence. Even if you manage to suppress it for a while, it'll only come back. So you're not really achieving anything. And the costs and the harms of doing so were known to be astronomical. And that's what we've seen. Yeah. So we did have those plans, and so the fact they were thrown out of the window was obviously in the panic of the moment was really not good. But what's really unforgivable right now is that 5 years later we have the £200 million COVID inquiry still coming out and not acknowledging that this was a big mistake and that we needed to go back to this pre-COVID orthodoxy, if you like, of these plans, sound science, and even more so given all that we've learned and all that we've seen in the last 5 years.
Indeed. Will, on that point, thank you. Very thorough stuff from Will Jones, editor of the Daily Sceptic. We'll get a virologist perspective in a moment. Dr. Chris Smith, who joined us quite regularly during COVID, consultant virologist at Addenbrooke's Hospital, is going to be with us in a couple of moments to shine some light on what he thinks this latest instalment of the COVID inquiry has produced and his thoughts retrospectively on lockdowns and the like. 0344 499 1000. This is Talk. Big news coming this December. Our talkTV app is moving to the Talk app. You can watch, catch up and listen to all your favourite shows and podcasts anytime, anywhere, all on the Talk app. From Monday, 1st of December, the talkTV app will no longer exist, so don't miss out. So head over to your App Store or Google Play and search Talk now.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
It's just gone 10 to 2. Let's get away with Chris Smith, consultant virologist, Addenbrooke's Hospital. Chris, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Ian.
Of course, we spoke quite a bit all those years ago. It's like we're being reunited here, and we don't look any different in those intervening years. But lots of things have changed, and of course, how this country functions still remained, some would say, irredeemably altered due to that curious time we went through. There were many factors in this. Of course, there's an economic argument. There is the social arguments as to what happened, and of course your area is that of health, and it's a big subject. It's not simple to just simply conjure up a sentence. I see people on social media, I'm sure if you ever take a peek, it's infuriating, but you see people with very bold statements in sort of very simple responses to things. But you were a supporter of lockdowns, right? When that was happening, you thought that was the right thing to do. Do you still think that?
That's not strictly true. I was a supporter of explaining the rationale for why the decisions that were being made were being made. I think it's more nuanced than saying you're either pro this or anti this. I don't dispute that when we first didn't know what we were dealing with, and let's just wind the clock back about 5 years or so, we had no idea what this virus was to start with. We had no idea what its biology was. We had no idea how it was going to spread, who it was going to infect, who it was going to leave alone, and who it was going to kill. And when you don't know what you're dealing with, the safest thing to do is to try to buy yourself time. Now, draconian as they are, lockdowns are very effective at driving down the transmission of an infectious agent. So it's not unreasonable if a government doesn't know how to stop something to use a lockdown at that point while we learn. We buy ourselves time. What doesn't work, and I'm really surprised that the COVID reports have not really pointed the finger at the fact that China did exactly what Baroness Hallett seems to have suggested would have been good, to really be draconian and agile and fast afoot to lock everything down. They did. They locked down the entire Chinese population pretty much for months to years.
Yeah.
Look what happened. As soon as they took their foot off the pedal, it came back with a huge flourish. They had enormous numbers, millions of cases, and they also had high mortality rate, which is the point that you can buy time, but you can't, just as Canute was trying to point out, you can't hold back the tide. You can't defer the inevitable. And around the world now, we think about 97% of the world population has had this infection. We've all had a brush with COVID. We predicted that was going to happen. The key thing was buying ourselves time to make sure that when we had our individual brushes with COVID, we were in a position to make sure we didn't become severely unwell from it, either because we were vaccinated or because we were in a low-risk group.
In terms of...
we should have... Go on.
I was, you know the world of viruses. This is your area, but is there? This is an airborne virus, okay? So there is a school of thought that, well, you can't duck it any way you like. Sticking your head in behind your front door is not going to stop it. Not touching a seat is not going to stop it. Not, the idea that you avoid walking past somebody in the street who happens to be 2 meters away from you rather than 1.5. It's not going to stop it. Could anything have stopped it or reduced it?
Well, that was the other surprising thing. I read through this report about procedure and so on. No mention of hand washing. We were being told to wash our hands with abandon at the start of all this, which really surprised me, quite frankly, because this is a coronavirus. We knew by the time those press conferences were happening it was a coronavirus. Coronaviruses are respiratory infections. They therefore spread through the air. So why there was a very strong emphasis on hand washing, which will help a bit. I mean, let's not pretend it doesn't. It will have made a small difference. But the elephant in the room is it's a respiratory infection. And as you say, Standing away from somebody more than a certain distance might help, but being very close to people, that's how these things transmit. It was very surprising when we're discussing procedure, which is what this current module is all about. There wasn't more made of the fact that we should have been clearer. This is a respiratory infection. This will spread through the air. This is how we can mitigate against that. Yeah, and I mean, I agree. Inviting 54,000 people to attend a football match or a horse racing meet was probably a silly thing to do. My 11-year-old could probably work that out. But simultaneously, others have argued things like wearing a mask. You know, I know that's an ongoing debate. You're probably fed up with that debate, but it is one that, you know, came up. Again, people saying, look, it's a bit of a mask. It's a bit of cloth. I mean, you know, there's gaps in the mask. It's not the sort of thing you wear if you're going to Chernobyl. So it's not going to stop you getting COVID. That again became a contentious issue, and the problem is it's again a nuanced thing. In hospital, the PPE given to staff, which are really high tolerance, well-fitting face coverings, FFP3 masks, which have really high stringency, they protected people from getting infected. They kept staff healthy when otherwise they wouldn't have been. But people making ad hoc face covering, strapping bits of material over their face, using surgical masks, which are not designed to be an infection control and defence measure, they're going to be less effective. That doesn't mean they're not effective at all, but anything is only as effective as a chain is as good as the weakest link. And if you're not using something consistently, if you're using it wrong, or it's not fit for purpose, it's not going to work as well as if you had something that was. So I'm not saying that masks would make no difference under all circumstances, that's wrong too, but to say if you do this we're going to be absolutely fine, which that was the sort of message going out a bit, saying do this or the sky's going to fall in, that wasn't the case. And it was more nuanced than that. And again, we're expecting that people would be able to understand all of the nuances and the intricacies, and it's too difficult for everyone to understand that all the time.
Of course. Finally, in terms of lockdowns, if this happened tomorrow, exactly the same pandemic and virulence of the problem, would you lock down? Would you suggest the country
It goes back to what I said earlier, in that if we know what the pathogen is, we know how it spreads, and we know who's at risk. That's the key thing. It's knowing who's at risk. You wouldn't have any merit through locking up a bunch of people who are at no risk. On the other hand, if everyone's at risk, then you'd say, well, let's buy ourselves some time while we work out what on earth we're going to do about this thing. If no one's at risk, don't lock anybody up. If we had our time again, what I think would have been a more effective measure, once we knew that the elderly were very vulnerable, people with immune problems were really vulnerable, people with chronic diseases were really vulnerable, we could have saved £500 billion, which is what was spent on the pandemic, we could have saved a big proportion of that if we put those very vulnerable people into a situation where they were beyond infection. So we did Meals on Wheels and kept them in their homes, but made sure they were okay and looked after, and they had company, and everyone else could go about their business, and then we would have had the same outcome, but at a fraction of the cost.
Listen, Chris, always great to speak. Thank you very much for your time. Dr. Chris Smith, consultant virologist, Addenbrooke's Hospital. Thank you to him. Back to you as well after this.
across the UK. On DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is Talk 3 minutes after 2 o'clock. So much to get through here. We are, of course, talking about the UK COVID inquiry, concluding that lockdowns could have been avoided entirely during the pandemic if ministers had reacted quicker to the emerging threat of the virus. It is a complex issue, no doubt about that. However, it's only when you look at it now and you realise the errors and the chaos and, as she described it, the toxic environment going on in government. More on that, and we're asking the question, how has lockdown affected your life? And I'm talking about at the time, but for many people, there's a bit of a legacy there. When they talk about long COVID, I'm not talking about the illness. I'm talking about the social knock-on ramifications of being locked down for all that time. It was horrendous. Also this afternoon, migrants are set to get big increases on the £3,000 voluntary return scheme as the Home Secretary looks to crack down on the migrant benefit bill. She's noted that it's better value than letting people stay. It's based on the Danish model. Well, that could mean paying some people, could mean 20,000 quid to go. I mean, that's good work if you can get it. You just get on a boat, come over here and go, yeah, all right, I'll go, give us 20k. And wealthier areas could face uncapped council tax rises as funding is cut and redirected to poorer towns, mainly in the north, under Labour's fair funding review. Wealthier, low-tax councils in financial difficulty may be allowed to raise bills beyond the current 5% cap. Be careful what you wish for on that one, anyone in government that's dealing with it. 0344 499 1000. Tim in Harrogate says, during lockdown, my local boozer had a scheme where you could rent a Scotch egg for £1. Obviously, if you decided to eat it, it cost a little more. The £1 went to charity, says Tim. Absolutely love that. One here as well from Paul in Worcester. I remember going into the pub and you could remove your mask at the table, but as soon as you stood up, the mask needed to go back on. Quite what this achieved, I can't say. That was when I realised society had gone mad, or at least our leaders had. It was a lot of madness. We can all agree on that. Let's get to work with Dan Hodges, commentator at the Mail on Sunday. Afternoon to you, Dan. I know you wrote a lot about this at the time, obviously, and you continue to do so. I mean, this report, I mean, it's nearly 200 million quid. I accidentally said 2 million quid earlier. I mean, I couldn't have... If only it was 2 million quid. So nearly 200 million pounds. It's not even over yet as well, because there's more, there's another instalment still to come. I mean, certainly yesterday, of course, a big headline grabber for a lot of what Baroness Hallett said. Give us your overview on what you made of it.
Well, I think it's an appropriate end, an appropriately shambolic end to what was an appropriately shambolic episode in our nation's history. I mean, it was quite clear to me whilst the inquiry was proceeding, and I this isn't hindsight, I did say at the time that it was quite clear that the whole thing had effectively become a shambles, and we've seen that with the conclusions. I mean, I think you sort of, as you identified, that the inquiry seems to, on the one hand, literally be criticising the government for not locking down sooner, but simultaneously saying they could have lockdowns could have been avoided completely.
Yes, yeah.
But I mean, in all seriousness, the key thing for me that was evident as the inquiry was going on was that for some reason, and I generally don't understand the reason for this, those conducting the inquiry had decided to avoid what for me is the fundamental issue, which is obviously we were not prepared for a pandemic on that scale. But one of the fundamental problems was, it's quite clear that ministers, that if you remember, the big question was, and the big charge at the government was, were they ignoring the scientific advice? It's quite clear from everything we've read since that ministers were attempting to follow the scientific advice, but the scientific advice was either fundamentally wrong, fundamentally incomplete, and fundamentally contradictory. And that is a matter of public record. I mean, I have done it, others have done it, everyone is able to do it. You can go back, because the famous Sage minutes were published at the time. You can go back and look at the Sage minutes, and you can literally look at what ministers were being told, and what they were being told by their professional advisors was wrong. Now, that's not necessarily criticism of the advisors, because this quite literally was turned out to be an exact science. But that key element of it, for me, is the most glaring omission from the report at all. There is no serious effort to scrutinise the fundamental problem, which was the scientific advice ministers, who are, after all, just politicians, they're not scientists themselves, that the advice given to the ministers was contradictory and was wrong.
And that in its, I mean, we've heard from Dominic Cummings over the years, who will always, given a chance, talk about this. But there's some elements of what he said that I did find interesting and very easy to believe, and that was a sort of the headless chicken scenario in Downing Street. They were running around and different people coming in, and Cummings thought he had some people who could supply answers, and you had Sage over there and civil servants over there. The former head honcho, who was Matt Hancock's, essentially boss in some respects, the permanent secretary, now got an even more senior position. You had all of these elements to this, and it was, she described it as chaotic in the report, and it's not hard to understand when all of that is going out. I wonder whether the lockdown thing, Dan, was sort of in a way, that sort of anti-intellectual path of least resistance.
I think, to be honest, what the chaos that was described is basically the chaos that is replicated within government or with any large organisation at a time when an unprecedented crisis strikes. Now, what surprised me was I had assumed, and others had assumed, that sort of all of this had been modelled. There'd been a lot of training, a lot of preparation, because a major pandemic was very close to, if not at the top, of what you would describe as the risk register that governments prepared for. But as we saw, and remember, this wasn't these weren't just sort of failings here in the UK. They were failings that were replicated globally. This is basically just what happens when an event, a crisis of this nature strikes. And I mean, you mentioned Dom Cummings. I mean, I'm not his biggest fan, and he's certainly no fan of mine. But I did think, I mean, he put up a post this morning, which I actually thought was quite interesting and had some validity. And he did, he identified this fundamental problem. As I say, the contradictory advice, the chaotic organisation. For some reason, the inquiry decided to ignore that and basically point the finger at the politicians. I suppose because there was a sense they're an easy target, and obviously Cummings himself. I mean, this whole section about Downing Street was sort of infested with Dominic Cummings' sexism and misogyny, and that somehow had some impact on all this. It just seemed very, very strange and out of place, because this should have been a very serious inquiry, which had basically one function, to just simply learn the lessons in a practical sense, so that if this ever happens again, we know what we have to do. But I mean, frankly, it may as well, for all the validity it has, it may as well be thrown in the bin. I mean, it
is. When you sort of delve into it, it's almost like 800 pages long. I gave it a good go, Dan, but I couldn't quite make my way through it without gnawing off my own elbows, because it does go into areas that are either, kind of why are they even going there, which you just alluded to, and spectacularly omits the fact that politicians are the sort of the messenger in many respects. I never thought for one second that Matt Hancock was a qualified epidemiologist. I didn't think he was a qualified anything, to be honest, but I never considered him to be the oracle of Delphi on all of this that we've got to believe. It was quite clear whatever he was saying, whatever Boris was saying, whatever whether it was Dominic Raab or Priti Patel, whoever was giving those press conferences, were getting the information was coming from elsewhere, and that is largely omitted from this rather expensive report.
Well, exactly. And I mean, this criticism of Hancock and Boris and others, that they were, that in a sense they were presenting this over-optimistic picture to the country. What were they expected to do? What were they expected? Was Boris expected to turn up at those press conferences and say, "You're all doomed, you're all doomed"?
Yeah.
I mean, the reality reality is these are flawed people. We don't need to go through again to rehash Boris Johnson's flaws, Matt Hancock's flaws, the flaws of those around them. These were flawed people in exceptional circumstances, dealing with an exceptional, once in a generation crisis, and they in the system simply were not up to the task. But then, in a sense, it was never going to be up to the task. Now, all we can do, it seems to me, is attempt in a more sober way, try and learn the lessons, put contingencies in place, so that next time something like this happens, we are in a better position. But the reality is, at some point in the future, this will happen again. No doubt there will be similar chaos, because what will happen is people will try and implement lessons learned from this that aren't applicable to the new crisis that they find. But I do think, I mean, in terms of the sort of nature of these national inquiries that we've had, this is really close to one of the worst and certainly the most unprofessional in terms of its conclusions that I've ever had the misfortune to read. And I said only half jokingly yesterday, I think, I generally think we might need to have a national inquiry into how this national inquiry has been conducted.
Yeah, I thought that was a good line actually of yours. Yes.
The amount of money that's been spent, an incredible amount of money that's been spent on this, actually, for the outcomes that we've received is I think not value for money, to put it mildly.
I'd like to see the breakdown, like you get a hotel bill, with your breakdown of what it costs, how they got to £193 million. But maybe we can wait a little longer, and then we'll delve into those figures at a later date, perhaps. Dan, while you're with us, just a word, if you would, on Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary. Lots coming out from her office this week, not always to the delight of some of those Labour backbenchers who are discombobulating by the moment. But she has, she's grasped this narrative. I don't know whether she can make it all work. And the latest thing we're hearing is about this kind of upping the amount of money you give to a migrant to voluntarily go back to their own country. I think it's about £3,000 right now. They've looked at the Danish model where those figures are far more generous. Which could mean that you could get 20 or 30,000 quid based on the Danish model. They've not said that is the case. But, I mean, the optics of that would be terrible, even if, as Mahmood says, it actually works out cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the first point, I mean, she certainly had a very good week in a broader political sense, in finally looking like there is at least a minister within the government who gets the nature of the issue and is trying to grip it and do something about it. I think, again, you're absolutely right. I think this, putting up in lights will give you £30,000 to come home, to go home. I'm not entirely sure that is necessarily tackling what we're told are the big issues, which are supposedly the pull factors.
Yeah.
I personally wasn't impressed with the idea that we're going to change the rules for people who are already currently going through a process of trying to secure citizenship. As I said yesterday, if we want people to obey the rules and play by the rules, we can't stop. We've got to stop changing the rules, at least for those people who are already here. But I think in terms of the broader point, you touched on the backlash from the Labour Party. The reality is everything that is happening and being done within government now is being run through the prism of what is perceived to be the imminent leadership challenge to Keir Starmer and the leadership contest that will follow that. So what we will see in the next couple of weeks is an increasing backlash against Shabana Mahmood's policies from both inside and outside the cabinet, because the Labour colleagues are simply prepping themselves for the leadership election, which will basically be a popularity contest judged solely by Labour Party activists and Labour Party members who do not like this political narrative.
Yeah.
So
I was going to say on that point, Dan, I mean, you speak to ministers off the record. Is it that serious? There is going to be a leadership contest at some point.
There is going to be a leadership challenge against Keir Starmer at some point, I would expect next year. Yeah, definitely.
Would that be after May, those elections, or are we looking at even before?
May is currently the sort of the date everybody essentially has got penciled in.
Yeah.
Some people within the Labour Party are now saying it may need to take a little longer, because some people are desperately trying to hope they can form some form of coronation, so they don't actually need a divisive contest. I think that it's unlikely they'll be able to unite around a single person, and always we have the issues of events. I mean, the reality is Keir Starmer has used up 8 of his 9 political lives. And were another major issue or political blunder or catastrophe to occur between now and May, at that point, I think those plotting against Starmer might move soon.
Yeah, spot on. Dan, thank you as ever. Dan Hodges is a commentator and, of course, journalist with The Mail on Sunday. Thank you to him. Gary says, I'm confused. It's either safe to return a failed asylum seeker to their own country or it isn't. So if it is safe for them to go back home with a few grand in their pocket, courtesy of the UK taxpayer, why can't we just kick these people out with a boot up their backside? They are a failed asylum seeker, therefore an illegal immigrant. The clue is in the title. Yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you? You failed. We don't pay you if you fail. You just go. If you fail, you get deported. Extraordinary. Back on the issue of COVID and all that goes with it, this one from Mark, who says, Ian, how many people out there had the COVID experience we did and enjoyed it? It was clearly a very mixed bag. We're both self-employed, so received nothing from the state. However, we are financially sensible and simply enjoyed a year off, walking the dog and building our own house. And we made a fortune because house prices went mad. In a nutshell, we do not know of a single death or even serious illness. We simply enjoyed it all, says Mark. That's interesting because that is, you know, I asked for an honest view of how it's affected you, and there is a very different one from many of the stories we are getting. But if you were in a position where all of your circumstances kind of aligned perfectly, then yeah, I could see how that would work. And there was a sort of calmness and almost a kind of regrouping of your life priorities, perhaps. Mark, thank you for that. More on the way. 0344 499 1000.
December 3rd is when Meghan's Christmas special is coming up.
What's the Christmas special? What?
Yeah, I mean, what do you do when you have no family members that you still talk to? How do you execute a Christmas special? I don't know, but yeah, I mean, what's so interesting to me is that the Kardashians have since removed all the pictures that they had posted of Harry and Meghan from the event.
They just don't get any luck, do they? Even the Kardashians, and then, you know, let's be honest, they're not the higher echelons of society financially. They want nothing to do with them now.
Across the UK. On DAB+. On YouTube. On your mobile. And on your side. This is Talk.
This in from Neil, who says, being a bin man, lockdown was lovely. No people or cars. The only problem was the amount of rubbish. People spent like it was going out of fashion. And I didn't get paid 80% to sit on my arse, as he says. Yeah, bang on. I mean, there were lots of people who still had to work their whatsits off, despite all of that. But yeah, if you do anything road-based, like if you were a cop, I was talking to a copper a couple of days ago, and he said that the only people that they saw regularly on the roads were sort of drug dealers and thieves. So he said it was an easy nick. And he said, just go out on a shift and go, well, there's a car that's probably not meant to be there. And he said so many times out of 10, it was a dead cert you were going to get something because no one was meant to be out. Lillian is in Nottingham. Lillian, what have you got for us? Good afternoon to you.
Oh, good afternoon to you too. I'm just getting fed up of you presenters going on about Boris Johnson and blaming him. Mm-hmm. He was not a doctor. He was not a scientist. It's all very well you pontificating after the fact when you have all the information that he never had.
Yeah.
And we had horrendous figures of deaths from China. Now, what was he supposed to do? It's all very well saying what you would do now you know, but at the time, what would you have done? Because you probably...
I'm with you 100%. I haven't made a criticism of him in that respect. I think the entire system can be criticised, and Dan Hodges just made the very good point that this new inquiry, this new report for part 2 of the inquiry, seems to do a lot of pointing the finger at politicians, but not the people that gave them advice.
Yeah, but even the people that gave him advice had no idea, because nobody had lived in our generation or in our time that knew anything about how to deal with this. It was just we were getting these horrendous figures from China of people, thousands dying. What were they supposed to do? Nobody knew what they were doing. They just had to do what they thought was the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, that is true, but we can't let everybody off the hook on this one, Lillian. I mean, there are plans and contingency plans that are down there that you can roughly go by. There are some, you know, to coin that phrase, there are some known knowns and there are some known unknowns. But it's not an entire blank sheet where we don't know anything, right?
Well, no, they didn't know anything, because the last thing that was like COVID was, I think it was 1919 flu, when millions died.
Mm-hmm.
And none of the people who were advising Boris at the time were alive at that
Well,
time.
no, but I mean, it's not about whether you remember it, is it? I mean, there's been other pandemics since then, and not perhaps as virulent as this one. We've had SARS. I mean, there were other issues that, you know, where influenza took a different turn, etc. But it doesn't... I mean, of course, you're absolutely right in the sense that could they have got it 100% perfect? No. Could they have got it better? Yes.
How? You tell me then. You know better than me.
Well, I don't know better than you. I'm listening to virologists and the guest we had on just before the news who explained that, you know, had people...
But what did they know?
Well... I mean, when you say what did they know, I mean, they know you know, there's a template is the point. You might not get all the details right, but there's a template, right, on how you can deal with things. So you look at the vulnerable, firstly. Sweden managed that. They also hadn't had anything like this for a long time.
Yeah, but Sweden don't have the population that we have.
No, they don't, and it's not. But even per capita, you know, similar stats apply. I hear what you're saying, but I think the idea that nobody was, you know, could have done better would be, you know, perhaps overstating it.
Yeah, and okay, but finally, can I just say this bloody stupid idea of giving illegal immigrants money to go away to another country? They're going to spend it coming back again.
Well, yeah, because you could maybe keep trousering another payment each time you do it.
Absolutely. I mean, do these people have a brain?
No. You're talking about those that implement it. Well, their argument is that actually, if you keep some of these people here, then the cost is far greater than paying somebody to leave. It's a bit like paying a ransom in a way. You know, it's not comfortable, but it makes a problem go away. That's the theory. Listen, Lillian, thank you very much indeed for that. I want to go to Liverpool. Dan is over here. What have you got for us, Dan? Good afternoon. Lockdowns, your thoughts?
Hello, Ian. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yeah.
So, during lockdown, during COVID, my cousin lost her partner due to a pregnancy sepsis. Unfortunately, when she was getting quite ill at the time, and when she went to the local hospital to check if she was okay, because she was worried while she was pregnant, they did a swab, said, "Oh, you've got COVID, so we can't actually allow you into the hospital."
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, they weren't able to diagnose the problem, and they ended up losing both my cousin's partner and the baby due to sepsis, unfortunately.
Oh, for God's sake.
And we found out that normally, under normal circumstances, she would have been seen as a priorities patient.
Of course.
And she would have been seen straight away. But unfortunately, due to the rules during COVID, that she wasn't allowed in. I'm not blaming scientists like Matt Hancock, not like Patrick Fisher and like that, sorry. But people like Matt Hancock and everyone, this whole inquiry, I don't want to know whether we should lock down hard or not. I just want the truth. Can we look into people's their bank accounts and just say, did anyone have shares in any of the vaccines? Did anyone have any interest to make extra money? I don't care. I just want the truth for both my families and my little nephew and cousins. So,
mate, I totally get it. And I don't even know if it's about, I mean, you know, if you're a government minister, you wouldn't be allowed to be, you know, on the take for that. And if somebody was, they're probably facing a hefty jail sentence. But I hear what you're saying. I think, you know, and it's a heartbreaking example of where this whole thing went horribly wrong, based on that. I mean, beyond anything, you could believe that during a health crisis, we're going to close down health centres. I mean, that's the bit. Thank you, Dan, by the way, for your call, and thank you to speak. We were struggling slightly to hear you just towards the end, but that's the area, isn't it, I think, for most people, where you'd say, OK, you don't need to have experienced a previous pandemic to address Lillian's point. You don't need to necessarily even be the world's greatest scientist or sociologist or social commentator to be able to draw the conclusion that you don't close down health centres or limit the availability to health centres. You are always going to end up with a problem at the end of it. Now, that could surely have been avoided. How you stop it in the first place, I get it. You know, everybody was saying the same thing. We don't know what this thing is. Is it going to kill everybody? Is it going to kill... I mean, of course you had people at the time saying, you know, this is rubbish. It's just a bloody cold. You know, people weren't saying that because they knew. They weren't saying that. They were saying that because they sort of wanted to believe that there was some sort of wider thing going on where, you know, we were being locked down as some kind of future test. That's why people were saying that. Let's be honest. If Matt Hancock didn't know, I don't believe Bob in Arbroath was, you know, somehow in possession of some, you know, secret little agenda that was going on out there. So there were things I think could have been done, and politicians, to a degree, could have been more forthright, certainly in their position on lockdown. So we kind of all got it a bit, didn't I? I think most people understood the first lockdown a bit. But then it started to become apparent that, you know, the average age of somebody dying was about 85. And by the way, that's not good. To say, well, you die, you know, you already had an underlying disease, that's no, I'm sorry, that's not good enough, is it? You know, if somebody is stabbed and then a day later they have a heart attack, you don't say they died of a heart attack. You say, well, they died because they've been brutally attacked the day before. It's not unconnected. The COVID thing did tip people over the edge, and lots of elderly people who might have lived for many months longer, they might have lived for more years longer as well. So we can't use that as the get out of jail card, but it was the most vulnerable group, and that's the group we should have targeted really and been more diligent on. I think her report is meant to be sort of trying to suggest that. And don't do silly things like have a massive football match or go to Cheltenham when you're already aware of what's going on in places like Italy or just over the pond in France. 0344 499 1000. We'll have more from you shortly. Our lines are open. This is Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is Talk. 0344 499 1000. Laura says, I wish the COVID investigation showed how many hundreds of thousands were negatively impacted because of the lockdowns. That's more useful data to prove. It must never happen again. And that was the bit. I'm trying to remember if this was in the report. It was in the report, wasn't it? That there should have been an economic kind of dimension. Like there was a SAGE group. And everybody, by the way, who was on the SAGE committee were not all kind of virologists and microbiologists and epidemiologists. There were behavioural psychologists and people like that. I can't remember the name of the woman that was on it. There was a communist woman on there. OK, it's a free country. You can be a communist if you want, but you can't help but wonder if that would anyway skew your observations on how a society might function better. But Laura is absolutely bang on. We didn't get that sort of information about what was clearly equally a crucial element. I think it was maybe a year and a half later, it might have been Professor Dalgleish who threw up that discussion that, you know, that there are some really sad and desperate stories around this, and there are also some realities about trying to keep a society going as well. I think that bit didn't really get the kind of look in that it should have done. Now, we know that Bereaved Families for Justice UK are representing 7,000 victims of COVID, say the inquiry clearly blames Boris Johnson for catastrophic mishandling, vindicating but devastating, arguing many lives could have been saved under a different Prime Minister. That is certainly one of the accusations. Olufemi Akinola, Lobby Akinola's father, died of COVID, aged 60. Let's get a word with Lobby now. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, William.
Nice to have you with us. Well, firstly, I am so deeply sorry to hear what happened in your family and the devastation. You know, I know how that feels. It doesn't go away. And I suppose what compounds it in your respect, is the thought that something might have been avoidable.
It's exactly that, as you say. It's the idea that so many people might still be with us had our government acted sooner. I think Lady Hallett put it very succinctly when she said it was too little, too late. And the result, unfortunately, is, you know, hundreds of thousands of families like mine.
Is blaming Boris Johnson too much of an easy target? I don't mean that in defence of Boris Johnson, but we're hearing a lot of people we're talking to today, whether they're scientists or, you know, even journalists, are saying, you know, actually you've got to go a lot deeper than, you know, the person that was giving the message, because there are, you know, hundreds of other voices that would have been throwing advice to number 10. I know his name's on the tin, Lobby, but, you know, is he the man that you look at as responsible, or do you see it as a wider issue?
It's 100% a wider issue. I think, as the report said, you know, there was a culture, a toxic culture in the cabinet at the time. So it doesn't end with Boris Johnson, but as you say, he was a leader. That's what leadership is. His name is the one on the header. So that's where we have to start. But we do ultimately recognise that it goes beyond that. And that's why, as a campaign, we've supported things like Hillsborough Law and a national oversight mechanism, because we need structures in place to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Indeed. And just it's important to say this as well. Your father didn't have an underlying health condition. He wasn't a cancer patient. He wasn't a particularly old man. He did daily exercise. He was very active mentally, physically and otherwise. So that really does bring it into sharp focus of how random this whole COVID thing was.
It does, you know. As part of this campaign, I've heard so many tragic and horrific stories of, you know, parents burying their children, stories that we don't want to imagine, let alone experience ourselves. And I think it's important to recognize that it's when danger is coming, you have to take every precaution to protect those, because it might not just be the most vulnerable. You never know who's going to be impacted. And as you said, just because someone is vulnerable does not mean that they should be thrown to the wolves. It's so vital that we consider everybody, because, you know, we're only as safe as our most vulnerable people.
Is it fair to say, although perhaps difficult for people like yourself to maybe dwell on this point, that, you know, when a government is working out a reaction to, you know, a pandemic, which, you know, suddenly, you know, one day it wasn't there and suddenly we see these headlines on the news. We all remember seeing Italy, and, you know, we know what happened in China, you know, however much we want to point the finger, whatever, you know, we were aware of something coming around the corner. But when governments are looking at how to deal with that, they have got more than one responsibility, haven't they? Or they should have. And that would be, yes, you've obviously got to help people and try and avoid, you know, people getting this as much as possible. But there's also such a thing as keeping a society going and making sure that healthcare is available to those who need it. That might be brutal in some respects, but they do have more than one consideration.
100%. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you that is the role of government. And that's why, you know, you have a range of experts, of voices at the table to ensure that you're getting a holistic picture. I think what I take some umbrage with is this idea that there's an either or. I think it's often presented as is protect the people or protect the economy. And
could have been both.
It could have been both. Yeah. The people are the economy. If people are too afraid to go to work, the economy stops. So we need to make sure that protecting people goes hand in hand with protecting the economy. And I think that was what was presented as a false equivalence, a false choice. And when we look at the report, as Lady Hallett said, we might not have had to have such stringent measures if we had acted sooner, if we had put in place methods, you know, to ensure that society could continue, but people are being protected at the same time.
What would that have looked like, though, Lobby? I mean, how you know, would it have been a week before, 2 weeks before? Should we have? I mean, I think it's utterly almost unforgivable that, you know, a football match with 54,000 people were allowed to happen, or some old rich folk to go betting on the horses at Cheltenham. I mean, I find that beyond belief, and they're obvious areas. They were the sort of headline-grabbing stories. I mean, that's just stupid, if nothing else. I mean, why, you know, would you take that risk? But is there anything that could have happened that we could guarantee? I know there's some modelling, and some people question that modelling, but how do we know that your father would have survived had the government done anything differently? I know that's a hard question, but it's one you must have thought about.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a fair question. I think what we can't say is anything is a guarantee. Everything is always up to chance. And if you take any medical intervention, any kind of diagnosis, we always talk about the chances, the likelihood of something happening. And what we do know is that had there been earlier intervention, it was significantly reduced the likelihood of people catching COVID and dying. And, you know, when you speak as to what kind of interventions we could have had, like, obviously I'm not neither a medical nor like, I guess, political expert or social expert, so I can't necessarily speak with authority on this, but sure. I think we can take insight from what other countries around the world are doing. You know, there are countries, especially in the East, that have more experience with pandemics. And, you know, we saw things like people wearing masks. We saw things like increasing working from home and things that we did eventually roll out in this country. Had we started those measures sooner, who knows how many people could still be with us? And I think, you know, the question that people should pose themselves, you know, is what would you do to increase the chances of your loved one being with you? I think most people would do almost anything.
And again, this is not a defence of any minister. And I mean, you know, sometimes you have to pinch yourself to remind you that Matt Hancock, for goodness sake, was the bloke in charge of health. I mean, that's a whole other story. I mean, that's beyond satire in many respects. But if you look across the world, you know, I'm sure there are people in France, there are people in Germany, there are people all over the place who will probably tell a similar story. I mean, in this country, obviously, we've got a divvying up of the way health works. So Nicola Sturgeon was in charge of Scotland, and in many respects, she doesn't come out any better from this than Boris Johnson does, because they were doing pretty similar things. But, you know, when it comes to death rates and excess deaths and the like, in similar-sized economies and populations, I think I'm right in saying, Lobby, that they do look kind of the same as this country.
I would have to double check that. I'm not 100% certain, because, you know, at one point in time, we had the highest death rate in the world. That's a very unfortunate title to hold. But I think it's really important to recognize that, you know, what we're looking for here isn't to be the average. You know, I have no aspiration of saying, oh, you know, it's kind of okay because other people fared as badly.
Yeah, it's not a race to the bottom in that respect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The question is, like, what could we have done better? Yeah. And I think it's clear, like you said, there's definitely choices that could have been made.
Yeah.
It's not to say that it's a global pandemic. It's a really sad truth that people were going to lose their lives. And there's absolutely no guarantee that my dad would still be here had the government acted differently.
Sure.
But I think what we can say is that more people would still be here. And the question I think the inquiry is trying to answer is exactly what are the steps that could have been taken so that we know that next time we don't let that happen.
And that is fair. Just a final question. How are the family doing, Lobby, and yourself?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, grief is, you know, a companion forever, unfortunately. But I think we're doing okay. Days like yesterday and today are difficult because you get thrown right back into those moments of, you know, my mom woke up in the morning, came downstairs to find her husband had died, and that's a moment that's never going to go away. But seeing things like the recommendations from the inquiry and seeing people, I guess, like rally together to remember those that we've lost is a comfort, and it, you know, it helps build a legacy that I hope for my father and all of those that we lost, that there will be change and that their passing will not be in vain.
Well, we pray and hope that is the case. Lobby, thank you for being with us. We really appreciate your time. That is Lobby Akinola. His father, Olufemi, died, age 60, fit guy, no underlying health issues. I don't honestly know the full answer to that, in the same way that I don't know the full answer to the vaccines. Somebody we sort of tacitly knew was, I think, one of the first people that was acknowledged to have died as a result of a complication from a vaccine. And this was a guy that worked in the NHS. So not somebody who just jumped into something. And are we always going to have, on all sides of this horrendous story, certain uncomfortable statistics? Some people with no underlying health conditions just died of COVID. I also have a friend whose mother died of COVID, and a similar thing, no underlying health conditions. The kind of roulette wheel stopped at them. And I think perhaps with the vaccine, we had similar things with that as well. I don't know whether there's ever going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to this entire story from start to finish that will satisfy everyone. I don't think such a thing is available. Marie is in Stroud. What are your thoughts, Marie?
Oh, gosh, I forgot. I was taken into hospital very early 2022 for a suspected heart problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I did the whole rounds of the area in the ambulance. I was in the ambulance for 10 hours. And finally, we went in. We tried again at the main hospital.
Okay.
And we were in a queue for 5 hours. And I was feeling more and more ill. So the ambulance driver, he said, I've had enough of this. He did an ECG. And he looked at it and he said, oh, this isn't good. He went rushing off, came back. I was rushed into A&E, a blood test, and it turned out that I actually was having a heart attack.
Cool.
Yeah, I know. So I was taken down into cardiology, and I was there for 3 days. And I had actually put myself into lockdown for 2 years, right? So I never had COVID. So I was in there for 3 days, and then they said I have to be taken to another hospital to have a special, I don't know, some kind of test in my arm for my heart. So they did a COVID test, and guess what? I caught COVID from the ward.
That happened a lot, didn't it? People getting COVID when in hospital.
Absolutely.
Tell me, did it, Marie, did COVID knock you for six? Were you kind of, I mean, some people it waved over them with no big implications. Other people didn't even survive it.
No, I had no symptom of it, and this is honest true.
Yeah.
Honest true. And I had the AstraZeneca vaccination. I never had the other one. Anyway, I was taken up into the COVID ward for 10 days of hell. And nearly every single person I spoke to who was there caught COVID from either the hospital or going into the surgery.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's true. I'm not, that is true. But I did come out alive.
Yeah.
And I did have a heart problem, and I was on medication for a year.
Sure.
But I still actually suffer a little bit with PTSD over it because it was awful. There were so many people there, and they weren't very well. And it was just the whole thing, wasn't it?
I get it, the whole thing, and you had a sort of double bubble there, because I suppose when you're told you've got COVID at the time, you think, right, okay, am I going to die? I mean, lots of... Marie, thank you for your call. So I had it, and had really no symptoms or anything at all, and, had it not been tested, I wouldn't have known I had it, etc. So it wasn't any big issue for me. I had mates, fit and healthy young guys who were absolutely knocked for six. One mate said he was almost crawling up the walls in discomfort. He said this is not like he'd had flu before, not man flu, proper flu. He said this was nothing like that. This was a whole different territory of respiratory jip that he'd never really experienced, didn't know what to do with himself, ended up in hospital, went to hospital, didn't end up staying in hospital because his case wasn't particularly acute. But he felt it was. It absolutely destroyed him. And then he did spend some time after that, like the effects of it, because he thought, this is, am I going to die? You're not really forced to. When you have a cold, again, when you joke about man flu, you go, am I going to live through this? It's like childbirth, but 10 times worse. You can make those remarks. He said this was definitely definitive new territory on feeling shocking. So I get it, and then others like me, absolutely nothing at all. 0344 499 1000. This is Talk.
you shouldn't be teaching a small child or inadvertently teaching a small child that if they give their consent, then an adult can touch them. That is the wrong message to
Yeah,
send.
it's weird. They've got it completely the wrong way. But again, I'd love to meet these people's kids. I'm telling you right now, they have tantrums in supermarkets and they walk on the table. I'm telling you that right now. I've met these people. I know these kinds of people, and their kids are all absolutely ghastly. I'm a 1950s mum, and I like my kid.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is Talk coming up on 5 to 3. Let's do a bit of Voice of Doom detail. This is day 8 of the Mystery Voice. Remember, it's a politician, dead or alive, left or right, young or old. You decide. Who is this?
Rightly and properly.
Can we hear that again?
Rightly and properly.
87222. If you think you know, we're not giving any clues at the moment. Way too early. Last time we gave some clues, it went absolutely pear-shaped. The whole thing fell apart. It wasn't even that generous, but about 58,000 people got it right on one very, very iffy clue. So we'll hold back on that. But it's a very simple instruction. Who is this?
Rightly and properly.
87222. Back to your calls. Martin in Exeter. What have you got for us, Martin? Afternoon.
Oh, hi, yeah.
Hi.
So there were so many weird things going on during COVID that I remember.
Yeah.
So my friend's dad, he was 90. He was in hospital with old age. And they were being tested for COVID every 48 hours. So he had his test.
Yeah.
It was negative. He died. Nothing to do with COVID. And then they put on his death certificate, COVID.
What?
And my friend refused to sign it. He said, look, we know he didn't have COVID, and we're not signing it. There's a big row about it.
Why? What was their reason for putting COVID?
Well, what they said was he'd been near some people who had COVID, but we knew he didn't have it.
But they were putting this down as the cause of death.
Absolutely.
I mean, surely that's criminal in some respect.
Well, there was quite a big row about it, and of course you can't get on with things until you got the death certificate.
No, of course.
My friend wouldn't sign it. So you've got that on the one side, and then if you remember, the government downgraded their death numbers quite a bit, quite a few times during COVID, didn't they?
Well, do you remember they started off talking about people who died of COVID, and then they modified that to died with COVID?
Yeah, so you've got, on the one hand, falsifying COVID deaths. You've got, on the other hand, bringing them down.
Yeah.
This is a final thing. My partner's son lives in Sweden. We went to Sweden during COVID when you were allowed.
Yeah.
And it was like stepping into another country. It was not even a thing.
Isn't that strange? But I mean, I don't know, when they talked about New Zealand sort of also dodged a lot of infections and deaths, I don't think that was down to some kind of masterstroke from Jacinda Ardern. Maybe there were just some places that didn't cop it in the way that others did. Listen, Martin, thank you for that. I mean, the death certificate thing is so iffy and suspicious. Hopefully, people who did have that put on death certificates were able to rectify it as you did. Ben is in Essex. What have you got for us, Ben? We've not got long, but I'm sure you can do it.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, that inquiry, what a waste of taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
I really believe that. And
it's only 200 million, Ben. What are you squealing about, man?
I know. Tell me about it. But no one talks about the implications of the economy, the mental health of people that lost jobs, lost businesses.
Yeah.
I know a few people like that that are still struggling to this day.
Correct.
And none of that gets spoken about. And I've not heard anyone talk about the Great Barrington Declaration.
Mm-hmm. Funny enough, I heard somebody mention it yesterday, but only in a phone capacity like this.
Yeah, because it's definitely made me not trust our government. And, since then I've started to go down all sorts of rabbit holes about, was it...
Got to be careful with that.
Yeah, I know.
The trouble is with Great Barrington is that there were some notable people that put their name to it, of course.
Yeah.
The argument that always comes up, Ben, because I remember at the time we had these discussions, about the Great Barrington Declaration, there were also like about 10 billion more medics on the other side of that argument.
Yeah.
That seems to be the if you like, the easiest response to it.
Exactly. I mean, I get the health side of it, and there's arguments about locking down, whether it was effective or not. But when you shut an economy down, that has drastic consequences.
Massive.
No one talks about that. And, you know, China might be different to us, where they're a bit more socialist and dependent on their government.
Yeah.
In the UK and America, you know, we are effectively a capitalist economy that relies on churn. You know, output.
It relies on activity, of course, and it relies on, you know, a small and medium-sized business. You know, it's not the Googles and the Amazons that keep this economy alive. It is those small and medium-sized enterprises that are actually more key to success. Listen, I've got to move, Ben, just for time, because we're about to hit the clock. Thank you very much. Great call, though. He makes a really good point about the lack of care around things like sorting out the economy and paying proper understanding to what the implications of that were. 0344 499 1000. We change gear and more coming up after the news, which is next.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
Coming up on 3 minutes after 3 o'clock. Yeah, welcome back to the home of Common Sense. We're taking your calls on the COVID inquiry, part 2. 200 million quid's worth of your taxpayers' funds thrown into the pot to try and establish what the hell went wrong. What we do know went wrong is that an economy was closed down for huge periods of time, and the effects continue to this day. But what effect did it have on your life? And has that recovered since? In whatever respect, just interested anecdotally to hear your stories on an issue and a moment of our history that is never going to be forgotten. Utterly devastating. Also this afternoon, migrants are set to get big increases on the £3,000 voluntary return scheme. This is as the Home Secretary looks to crack down on the migrant benefit bills. She has noted that it's better value to pay people more than to let them stay. The optics for that, by the way, are horrific. Paying somebody £20,000 to go back to their country of origin is not a good look, even if, oddly, it turned out to be cheaper. Why should we have that problem? And wealthier areas could face uncapped council tax rises as funding is cut and redirected to poorer towns. This is under Labour's Fair Funding Review. Wealthier, low-tax councils in financial difficulty may be allowed to raise bills beyond the current 5% cap. More on that on the way. 0344 499 1000. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk. Just want to read this one out from David in the Cotswolds, reference a bit the COVID story. David says, I was living in Spain during the COVID epidemic of 2020, and we were in lockdown for a relatively short space of time compared to what happened in the UK. From start to finish, the state of emergency in Spain lasted from the 15th of March to the 21st of June. During that time, there were various steps taken to relax the rules, and this began in the April, including the schools opening. By the summer, the memory of being locked down was fading. As we headed into Christmas, it was history. I can see the psychological effects of lockdowns in the UK is far more prevalent than it was in Spain. I think this is because you were frequently going in and out of lockdowns, having different tiers you could and couldn't travel to, and having heavy fines imposed by the police. All in all, it seems there was a great deal of mismanagement from beginning to end. There was a heavy reliance on scientific advice, and there was a failure to look at the country as a whole and the economy. This inquiry seems to have overlooked that. Spain didn't get everything right, but their autonomous regions had more control and held a local view and didn't leave everything to centralised government like the UK did. That's a great point. I know and Spain often comes up as an example, and David, thank you very much for that. The obvious answer that people give is that it's more of an outdoor country, and therefore that in itself carries with it more possibilities for easing lockdown. Although you might argue if everybody's outdoors together, then it doesn't. But you take the broader point. People did look at Spain. I remember at the time looking at the stats, and Spain did, I think, of all European countries, come out of it quite well. And in terms of what was going on in this country, they would have looked at Spain, right? They would have gone, right, OK, what is Spain doing? Can we do the same here? And somebody somewhere would have whispered in someone's ear and gone, actually, no. But then, of course, you juxtapose that point that David's made with the previous guest we spoke to, whose father died of COVID, who is thinking, well, actually, that might have made, over here, would that have made things worse? We're a big hub in this country, of course, airports, travel and all the rest of it. 0344 499 1000. So let's move then to this story, which I mentioned a little earlier on. Wealthier areas could face uncapped council tax rises as funding is cut and redirected to poorer areas. This, of course, is Labour's Fair Funding Review. I'm always a bit itchy when I hear the phrase Labour's Fair Funding Review. I mean, what constitutes a Labour Fair Funding Review may well not be what everybody else would consider a fair funding review. It is worth, however, having if you're worried and thinking, there's problems that's going on, don't worry, because the government have already given you their word on what they're not going to do. Have a listen to this.
I'm determined to put money back in the pockets of working people. And that's why a Labour government would freeze council tax this year. No ifs, no buts. Labour would freeze council tax next year. We're going to freeze council tax next year. You could rip up that council tax bill because you would not pay a penny more than you paid last year. Yes, you heard it right. Not a penny more on your council tax.
None of those pledges in our manifesto requires increases in council tax.
No, we're not planning to reform council tax.
That is what we would do in government. Is he going to do what a Labour government would do and announce an immediate freeze in council tax bills? We're often asked the question, when you criticise the government, what would you do? Well, we're saying what we would do. We would freeze council tax.
freeze council tax. There you go. It's not going to go up. Oh, apart from the fact that it might go up. Matthew Lesh is Public Policy Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Matthew, good afternoon to you. I would love to be able to say my Prime Minister, there he is, promising, and all the other ministers in there as well, Wes Streeting, Rachel Reeves, your council tax isn't going to go up except for where it's going to go up. That seems to be the line now.
Well, look, nothing can be more pernicious for political trust than politicians who literally say one thing before the election, despite knowing all the facts in advance, and then determining something completely different on the other end of it. I think this case of a council tax review, what they're calling a fairness review, is really undermining the fundamentals of what is meant to be devolved in local control in Britain. The basis of this is that there are some areas that have been quite successful managers. There might also be wealthier areas in the country that have, relatively speaking, lower levels of council tax rates.
Sure.
The government doesn't like that very much, so instead they're going to basically redistribute money. Now, Britain is already an extremely redistributive country. We have there's some data that was in the Financial Times today around just the fact that the amount that top taxpayers pay in the UK proportionally to middle-income earners is significantly higher. Top taxpayers in the UK, those who are wealthiest, are already paying far more than their fair share. Now, what the government's done, though, in this case, is they've said, well, there's some areas in the country that aren't paying even more than they could be. What we're going to do is we're going to effectively take some money from them. We're going to give that to areas that we like, happen to be Labour council areas, and then we're going to force those areas to put up their council rates. I think that's really undermining all the incentives to run councils well, because if you run your council poorly, if you've spent badly, then you're just going to get subsidised by the government here, rather than forcing you to run your services better and keep costs down and keep council rates down.
Yeah, and it also sort of presupposes that, just because you might live in a nice area and you might even have, stumbled across, a position where you can buy a nicer house, it doesn't mean that everybody is flush. And other people, even those of the middle classes, aren't also experiencing a cost of living crisis. I mean, it's a very obvious socialist argument, isn't it? Well, if you live there, you're worth more money, so we'll take more money from you.
Well, that's basically all it is. It's a cash grab. It's a redistributive cash grab, as if that doesn't already exist extensively in the UK. And we should just remember here that the point of local councils is not to redistribute money around the country. It's to create a connection between your councillors, the money they raise, and the money that they spend. Now, that may be imperfect, but you want to create a local accountability. This whole scheme completely undoes that. It loses that accountability. It means the councils that aren't spending well, who are wasting money, who aren't necessarily getting the best value for their local ratepayers, are going to effectively get bailed out by the rest of the country. And then those places that have been behaved better are going to be facing high council rates. So there is, that Labour talks about a fairness review, but in fact, there's nothing fair about any of this.
No, not at all. And of course, the budget is probably going to be a long list of things that don't look particularly fair. I mean, what's your take, Matthew, on this? They've not ruled out a wealth tax. I know a wealth tax is an interesting, sort of an umbrella term, really. There's many ways that can happen. I mean, this would be an example of it, what we're talking about here. But perhaps the Treasury are thinking of something more substantial in that area. What are your thoughts on what might happen next week?
Yeah, I mean, people like the sound of welfare taxes superficially, particularly because when they hear wealth tax, they think somebody else paying for something rather than themselves. Of course, the problem is ultimately we're all going to have to pay if the government introduces a wealth tax, because it would be extremely destructive to Britain's economy. We've already got near zero growth in this country. If you want a surefire way to scare away the people who are going to bring investment, who are going to create jobs, who are going to be the innovators and the entrepreneurs, you introduce a wealth tax. That's certainly what's been found everywhere else that wealth taxes have been introduced. Socialist France, of course, did try wealth tax, and then they undid it quite famously in the last decade because it didn't work and because it ended up leading to less money for the government in the end. I think what the government's practically going to do here is they're going to play around with capital gains taxes in some probably not particularly helpful, but not entirely destructive way. So I think there's a bit of talk about increasing perhaps the general rates of capital gains taxes, and talk about some kind of exit-based capital gains taxes that when you move overseas, you might have to pay some capital gains tax on the assets, rather than being able to pay capital gains in your new jurisdiction. I think they're gonna fiddle around and they're gonna call that a wealth tax, rather than a percentage of people's wealth above a certain income, which can I say would be an absolutely bonkers idea. I mean, if you start taxing people, let's say 1% on their assets, supposed assets above, let's say 10 million, that is going to lead to a massive departure of wealthy people from the UK. It would be a substantial amount over time. But also, just on top of that, a lot of people have wealth that isn't particularly liquid. So you basically...
Well, that's the bit I can't... Yeah, I mean, I can't work that bit out. I mean, you might live in a beautiful house and you might even live in a bit of a castle. And I'm not, I'm not suggesting you're... no one's going to cry for somebody who lives in a castle. But it is completely possible you have zero income. You might be living on a pension, for goodness sake. Where are you going to get £10,000 a year from, or 20 or whatever it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's practically impossible for a lot of people. It leads to starving of assets. I mean, quite famously, British aristocrats have struggled with cash flow for hundreds of years, particularly when things come to things like inheritance tax. Maybe they're not the most sympathetic of individuals, but I think where this will hit are people who want to build companies, let's say, in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
They might, on paper, they own this company. The valuation of that company might be very high, but for now, they can't sell it because it's privately owned, or they can't sell a large amount of their shares. What are you going to do in that situation? Well, if you want to keep building a company, you're just going to go somewhere else. You're not going to stay in the UK. So all these kind of ideas end up ultimately doing more damage than good, and certainly not the best way. If anyone wants to raise tax revenue, this is not the best way to do it whatsoever. I think it's perhaps the most damaging way to do it.
What's your take, Matthew, on the more obvious answer for many people, the more obvious answer, and that is just to simply raise the top rate of tax. So you have a 50% rate that kicks in after you earn, I don't know, 250,000 a year. So that would be a big increase from 45 to 50. Is that doable? Does it make the kind of money you think it's going to make, or does that also send people screaming for the hills?
Well, look, I would say the obvious answer would be to get spending under control and for the government to actually live within its means. And there's actually new research out from Tom Cockett at the IEA today, just making the point that over the last 20 years, government spending has grown by about 2.5% a year. That's despite population growing by about 1%, the economy growing by about 2%. The problem is the British state not living within its means, and this government's complete inability to control spending. We should remember that the reason why gilts went mad, more so than anything else, was because the government could not get quite small welfare reforms through Parliament. And that just showed that this government, despite their talk about fiscal responsibility, couldn't get at. But back to your more substantial point about raising income tax, it would raise a little bit of money, undoubtedly so. It wouldn't raise anywhere near the amount of money to fill the holes. Ultimately, if the government wants to raise substantial amounts of money, and this is why I think they've actually abandoned broad-based income tax rises, is because you really do have to hit middle-income earners. That's where the vast majority of people are, and that's where the revenue comes from. It will hit middle-income earners more than anyone else, rather than top earners, in order to get a large amount of money out of it.
Okay, Matthew, thank you. Matthew Lesh, Public Policy Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you to him. Back to that question on COVID. Helena says it's not true the hospitals were closed to all but COVID patients. They were overrun with patients, plus staff sickness. Then staff, especially anaesthetists, had to be diverted from theatres to ITU and COVID wards. That's true. I don't think everybody's saying it was closed, as in literally, but people were strongly advised to remember. I mean, they did say, and I can't remember if it was in this report or whether it was said by a specific politician, that the Save the NHS, what was it, lockdown, shut your mouth, save the NHS, or something like that, that thing was not a very helpful thing, because many people were put off going to hospitals when they might have needed to, because that message sort of suggested that, unless you're dying, don't really, there were lots of other injuries in between. And of course, nobody really worked out a grander plan. And again, this is one of those stories that you hear people call in, and we've had it, and gone, I was in hospital during COVID, and there was no one there. It was dead in there. Not no one, but it wasn't like, it was so quiet. Unusually, it's obviously quiet, because the Bunyan Clinic is not going to open. The oncology department might open, less than it used to. These are really important department, of course, for obvious reasons. So you've got to look at, and then other people, when I was in hospital, which wasn't during COVID, but talking to a couple of the nurses who were there during COVID, they said it was a nightmare. It was absolutely, chocker full of people with huge respiratory challenges. Many of them didn't make it, and that was down to COVID. So there's no one-size-fits-all answer. Dave is down in London. Dave, what have you got for us on lockdowns?
Yeah, on your point about hospitals, Ian, I've got some blood cancer issue at the moment, and I'm in and out all the time, and I just have blood test after blood test after blood test. It never stops. I had a virus. I was in blood test after blood test after blood test, and I had a reaction, same thing. So if you're not in hospital, who's doing the blood tests to work out what's wrong with your body? Because if they don't do the blood test, they can't work out what your problem is anyway.
Yeah, and they were the kind of procedures, weren't they, that people felt put off for going to, or sometimes, you know, often cancelled. And so we'll have to do your blood test, you know, we're going to cancel it until we can find a better time.
Well, even if you think you've got COVID, someone's got to do a blood test for them to work out. I don't know if you've ever seen a blood test. It's about 70 lines of information. And I now know my bloods pretty well. If your C-reactive protein is up, you've probably got a virus. If something else is up, it's whatever. So unless they do that, they don't actually know where to start, to be honest. And then they start guessing anyway what might have caused it. But anyway, I was calling to say that, there's still stuff from lockdown, right? I'm pretty sure all of your callers know of a road nearby. I know of 3 near me that are still closed.
Yeah.
They've got a barrier, a plastic barrier across them, saying you can't turn left down here anymore. Still there since COVID. The tip that you mentioned earlier, you have to book still for the tip.
Yeah, they didn't get rid of that, did they?
No, it's a whole booking, a whole booking service. But one of my other things, I was listening to James on your show earlier, and I want these civil servants named, these top 23, Wormold, whatever he called him, the most powerful person in Britain.
Yeah.
I want these 23 people listed and named, and I want them in front of inquiries, because they're the ones that are taking the decisions. The politicians are puppets. They don't take.
No, they don't know anything about, you know, viruses or epidemiology. But the trouble with that, Dave, is that every one of those people, I'm pretty sure, I don't know them, but I'm pretty sure they went to work each day hoping to solve a problem. They didn't go to work saying, I don't want to solve a problem. They wanted to solve a problem, but something goes wrong in that it's either down to that unique thing called inability, and people that are not quite as wise as perhaps their employers thought they were when they hired them. It might be a bit of that, but underneath it, they would say, no, I did everything I could. That's going to be their stock answer, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and don't forget, the world was rushing along to see which leader in the world could be the person to lock down the most. I mean, that
is another part of this. You're absolutely bang on. I felt strongly about that for years. I always thought that there was a little bit of this where politicians sort of want to firm up their credentials. They need to believe they know things that we don't know. And I don't mean top secret stuff. They have an inner eye to a dilemma or a problem that most of us don't have. And so if they lock people down, weird as it is, as strict as it is, they feel more satisfied that they might have done something right.
Yeah, and also, if you remember, when they said Johnson will be addressing the nation at 5 o'clock, all of a sudden, oh, hang on a minute, Nicola Sturgeon's rushing onto the stage at 4 o'clock.
She was there every day.
What does she want?
Sturgeon did every day. It was interesting, though, that during that time, though, Dave, if you remember, Boris Johnson's star began to fade and then fall dramatically. Nicola Sturgeon's rose. She was seen as some kind of hero, even though they were doing exactly the same thing. They had pretty much the same death rates and same issue with care home deaths as well. I never did understand that. I don't think I ever will.
Yeah, it would be the same today if Starmer were doing it. The BBC would be all over it, like, well done, Sakir, fantastic, well done. If suddenly Kem is in charge or Nigel, then, oh no, hang on a minute, contest. But my last point is, this inquiry is concluded. We should have shut down earlier. So therefore, the inquiry has said, if ever this happens again, we will lock down harder and earlier.
Or we put things in place that avoid us locking down.
No, they won't, because the next time it comes along, just like when I said when I go into hospital and have the odd virus, they don't know what it is. So they kind of just go,
well,
the problem.
Yeah, that is exactly. Yeah, exactly. We spoke to the virologist earlier, highly qualified man. He said that was the problem. We didn't know what it was. Listen, I've got to stop there, Dave, for time. Great call, and I wish you well as well on your journey to getting things sorted. Lots to talk about here. 0344 499 1000. Whether it is this, whether it's the issue of taxes going up, a wealth tax. What does a wealth tax look like to you? This is Talk.
You shouldn't be teaching a small child or inadvertently teaching a small child that if they give their consent, then an adult can touch them. That is the wrong message to
Yeah,
send.
it's weird. They've got it completely the wrong way. But again, I'd love to meet these people's kids. I'm telling you right now, they have tantrums in supermarkets and they walk on the table. I'm telling you that right now. I've met these people. I know these kinds of people, and their kids are all absolutely ghastly. I'm a 1950s mum, and I like my kid.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
We have the voice of doom, of course. The answer. Well, do we have the answer? Just before the news, of course, at just before the 3 o'clock news, we played you this voice.
Rightly and properly.
Very simple question. Who is that? These are some of the guesses. Reginald Maudling. Never known who he is. I know he was an MP. I mean, like literally decades and decades ago. His name comes up. Former Home Secretary. When was he the Home Secretary? Finn? Come on, he's in my ear giving me. 1970 to 72. He was the Chancellor in the 1960s, 62 to 64. Meddling Maudling, as we know him. He was across all portfolios. Anyway, it's not him. Chris Patten, former Cabinet Minister under John Major, of course, and the last Governor of Hong Kong. I know that much. It's not him. Willie Whitelaw, who was Margaret Thatcher's possibly Home Secretary, I think. Is that right, Finn? I think so. We're checking. David Owen, David Lloyd George, no. It's not David Mellor either. We don't have a winner. we don't have a winner, which means it rolls over for day 9 on Monday. Stand by for all of that. Let's go back to your calls. Dan is in Portsmouth. On the old lockdown scenario, Dan, what have you got for us? Afternoon.
Hello, bud. Yeah, good afternoon. Yeah, this subject, I think, is one of the political subjects makes me most angry than anything else that's gone in my life, if I'm honest with you. And mainly because of what's happening now. People are just forgetting about it. It's a thing that everyone, they know they had their pants pulled down and they just want to forget about it and pretend it didn't happen, but it did. And I reckon in years to come, when all the people whose backs they're all covering, all the people that had their fingers in the pie and made stupid decisions and did whatever they did, when they're all gone, some clever so-and-so is going to do the sums and work out, A, lost life years as opposed to lost lives, right, which I always thought was more important, all right? It's sad when people die when they're sort of 60, 70, 80, but they're going to go anyway. But it's the youngsters, it's the indirect deaths, it's the people that died of cancer, the people that caught cancer and didn't get diagnosed. They're only in their 20s or in their 30s. And then you add up the indirect cost of what it cost us rather than just put your head down and go through it. It was just nonsense. The whole episode was nonsense.
What could they...
Mexico,
Go on, say again, Dan.
In Mexico.
Yeah.
I was in Mexico at the height of the lockdown. I was flying when no one else was flying because I work internationally. I was on aeroplanes that were empty. Places like Mexico, they couldn't afford to have a pandemic. They didn't. They didn't lock down, right? That's a poor country, tightly packed in the cities.
Yeah.
The only thing they did was sensible. You go out, you were completely free. You go into a shop, every single shop, every enclosed space, all they did was test your temperature. Now, how sensible is that? They check your temperature, and if your temperature's up, you just got turned around. It's as simple as that. But other than that, their meagre economy, they kept it going. They couldn't afford to have a pandemic. What we did was a travesty, and we should be in jail.
I know it feels. You're right. I mean, the anger. I can hear the anger, Dan, and it's not misplaced anger either. But most countries did have a form of lockdown, right? And most countries did something pretty similar to what we did.
Only after China did it. They all looked at China, panicked for whatever reason. I don't know the answers. I don't know why they did what they did. I think it was just lack of courage. People like Johnson, what they didn't realise is that was their Second World War. That was their moment to step up to the plate and do something statesmanlike. And none of them had the courage to do what needed to be done. And what needed to be done was him to stand in front of those Union Jacks and say, if you're old, if you're sick, you need to stay at home. Everyone else... you got to get out there.
But they didn't know that at the beginning, did they? That's always the defence that comes out, Dan. They didn't. Right at the beginning, they didn't know what this thing was, And I can remember, I'm not spooked that easily, Dan, and I largely share most of what you've just said, by the way. But I do remember, going to bed and thinking, is this going to be like the flipping plague? Is one of us in this house not going to be here in a couple of weeks? Is it that bad? So there was that little moment. That wasn't, nobody was scaremongering. It wasn't that. We just didn't know what the hell it was. And I think there were lots of people swiping, weren't there, saying we need to lock down harder, faster, stricter. I don't know what they thought they were going to achieve, but that was also a big voice in the government's ear.
I agree with you. And at first I was the same. At first I was right in with it. But then it didn't take very long, all right, before you start looking and listening, looking at numbers, looking at the things they were telling you on the news, looking at the death rates, looking at the TikTok dances, and then all of a sudden, after the first lockdown, I'll give them that, let them have that one, let them have that one for luck.
Yeah.
The others, no. I'm sorry. By then we knew it was nonsense. Absolute nonsense.
But why would they? So why would they want to carry on something that? I mean, you're putting it in a very straightforward way, and I'm sure if there was some head honcho here from either government or science, they'd go, look, it might have looked like that, Dan, but this is what we were dealing with. Why would they want to carry on something if it was demonstrably nonsense?
I think they were cowards. I think that the people in charge were cowards, and the people that weren't in charge wanted to see that people that were in charge fall on their faces. Simple as that. It's just as simple as that.
Got it. Dan,
simple as that.
No, I hear you. Powerful stuff, and it does force you into that kind of sense of utter incredulity. Thank you to Dan in Portsmouth. When you look back at it, and it's hard to remember the specific kind of timeline of when it became... Maybe it was at that point when the government stopped saying people have died of COVID and then changed it to with COVID. That was a factor. That doesn't mean that it was okay that you died. There is a harsh reality that, you know, living on planet Earth will throw up a pandemic sometimes. You know, the idea that you're going to solve it all is like, you know, suggesting that humans can solve climate change in some... You know, it's in that ballpark. You know, there's certain things, if there's a pandemic, by definition there's a pandemic. Some people are going to cop it, some people will get ill, some people sadly won't survive. When we started to get the data, which is Dan's put, the data that suggested that the average death rate was sort of 85, and if you were a child you almost stood no chance of getting... You might get it, but nothing's going to happen to you. That was the point, wasn't it? But by then, of course, it was all about don't contaminate grandma. Remember those kind of lines? I think Johnson even said something to that effect. 0344 499 1000. We'll have more from you coming next on Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is indeed Talk. 0344 499 1000. And we're back to one of these kind of stories again. More than 500,000 young men are not working or studying. What is going on here? Over 500,000. Not in education, employment or training. They're called NEETs. Totaling 946,000 in July to September. 196,000 more than the amount in 2019. Pat McFadden, him of the government, says the figures have been far too high for so long. Well, he's a regular genius, isn't he? Connor Tomlinson with us, writer at Courage Media. Connor, you need people like McFadden, don't we, really, on the scene, just to really call it out and tell it like it is. What a man he is.
Yeah, I think the only reason they put Pat McFadden on the case is because David Lammy has one too many job briefings and his mastermind can only handle so much, Ian. I think, if I might, a lot of the analysis around this, it says that 1 in 8 young people aged 16 to 24 are not in education, employment or training. A lot of the analysis around this is about economics, but I'm quite interested, if I may, to talk about the sort of cascading second-order effects that aren't just filling up the pension pot or making sure Rachel Reeves can send more of our taxpayer cash halfway around the world or spend it on a migrant hotel. One of the major problems that this does cause is young men's sense of self is dilapidated. But there was a survey that was published earlier this week in the Times that said a quarter of young men of the same age group believe no one will ever love them. how do you have a civilization where men not only can't prove their worth to themselves in meaningful work, and they don't think they're going to be able to buy a house from the proceeds, they've been taxed for things that you wouldn't believe, but also that sense of self-worth is instrumental to them having a wife and settling down and having children. And if we look at the data across the pond in the US in a social attitude survey that was taken in September, it's the number one reason, their number one life goal among Gen Zers, men who voted for Donald Trump, and that's the majority of Gen Z, is having children. Whereas for their female counterparts, both for conservative-leaning and liberal-leaning women, it's having a job or career you find fulfilling and gaining financial independence. So by being economically disadvantaged, by dropping out of the workforce, by engaging in surrogate activities like video games, watching Twitch streamers, or pornography all day, men are in this vicious cycle where they're probably not going to get gainful employment, they're not going to have a good sense of self-worth, and they're probably not going to have the families they dream of. And I think that's just a personal tragedy.
Yeah, and I also think, and this won't be popular with everybody, we've sort of, you know, in this curious upside-down world we live in, Connor, we've sort of, you know, attempted to feminise men in many respects and sort of remove, you know, that idea that, you know, you have a sort of masculine kind of responsibility. It's a bit old-fashioned, that, although, it, you know, history tells us it's worked rather well for centuries. All of that out the window, you know, you've got to, you know, and if you dare to think otherwise, that's called toxic masculinity and all these other horrendous titles they will throw at things. And of course, it's the usual case that, you know, certain groups of academics turn up at Downing Street and ministers who know mostly the square root of jack all will sort of buy into it. Oh yes, that's what we've got to do. You know, boys need a more, you know, a calmer, different kind of environment. You know, we've done it with the police, we've done it with the army, we've done it all over the place. That all feeds into this, right?
Definitely. I think what's happening here is we're seeing a elevation of women to the perceived status of what men had in the past, and a leveling down of men to the social attitudes of women. Helen Andrews calls this phenomena the great feminization, where she says that every institution, be it the market with ESG scores and they're very socially progressive, or academia or the government, takes on the aspect of kind of the attitudes of a girl's lunch table, where anything offensive is smacked down. The way that men compete and exchange information rather than emotions is frowned upon, and so men either don't want to enter those institutions because they feel unwelcome and so end up not in education, employment or training, dropping out the system entirely, or if they do participate, they're miserable because they can't participate on their terms. Yeah. And then in the inverse, lots of young women have been encouraged to be distrustful of men, to see any of their competence as proof of racist, sexist, historical, patriarchal oppression, and so have been sought to find economic independence from men, but often doing jobs that aren't meaningful to them, that detach them from the relationships that they find give their life colour and meaning. And so you've got men and women competing for equal opportunities on equal terms that aren't ergonomic to the ways they relate to each other or actually do things in the world. And so you've now got what my friend Nina Power calls a sibling economy, where men and women are less Adam and Eve and they're more Cain and Abel, and so it's no wonder everyone's at each other's throats.
Yeah, it's very old-fashioned to talk about gender differences. You know, that's almost the minute you raise that point, you know, somebody will, there's always some smart ass in the room will go, well, what are the differences? It's like, well, how long have you got, frankly? I mean, there is, if somebody wants to have a serious conversation, let's have it. But, and of course, having differences does not mean there's a lack of equality. If that is the word people are striving for, then, yep, you know, we can hand that out, because it's not about equality. It was never about equality. My mum and dad had very obvious stereotypical roles, one might say, when I was growing up. But there was no sense that one was, you know, better than the other, or one was, you know, unequal to the other. They just had very different roles, and both were completely crucial.
Yeah, and I think this is a lot of the current moral panic around the likes of Andrew Tate and Red Pill, manosphere ideology, which, I mean, the Cabinet Office has been advised to set up an entire department to sit there and watch TikToks that the creators of adolescence don't like. That's the level to which this is apparently the great catastrophe facing our civilization is, you know, single men without girlfriends complaining about it on the internet. But it's interesting how that attempt to play whack-a-mole with male influencers online, that, I mean, the likes of Andrew Tate say inflammatory things and used to run a porn company, so he's not my great idol. But the idea that is a greater threat than men and women not being able to couple up and have children sustain a civilization at all, and the idea that one expression of resentment by one sex in reaction to culture, academia, media, the government demonizing that sex for many years. The idea that the reaction is worse than the original problem is itself absurd. I think we just need to put the resentment aside on both sides, be more honest about what the sexual differences are, what the sexes want and should expect from one another.
Sure.
And if the government wants to encourage more young men into employment or training, make it easier for them to be a single income household breadwinner again, because that's going to get more men feeling better about their job and their lives and having the families that we need to replenish the sub-replacement birth rate.
Yeah, spot on. And of course, you did raise something there, largely a separate point, but it feeds into this, Connor. I think it's always worth saying that Adolescence was not a documentary. It was just a drama. It was sort of okay in parts. I was impressed of how it was filmed. I didn't for one second think it was some, amazing revelation about society or the typical disposition of young men. And it's extraordinary how many politicians jumped on that one. Same thing again, right? Jumped on that. So this should be shown in schools. No, it shouldn't.
Yeah, well, it was curious that the charity that was behind it was, one, received government funding, but two, putting out the pyramid of toxic masculinity that said at the bottom, saying boys will be boys leads ineluctably to genocide and rape, which is absolutely demented.
Yeah.
As a young man of the sort of cohort that Adolescence was targeting, but as well with an audience of young men of similar age, the fact that they focused on a young boy who got radicalized through social media but barely interacted with red pill content, stabbed this girl when he is not of the demographic of the story that inspired the stabbing, and also from a married, cohesive, working class
beautiful family.
Yeah, it just doesn't paint a representative picture. Instead, the main concerns are things like left-wing radical violence, as we've seen with the alleged murder of Charlie Kirk, online pornography, which didn't even feature in Adolescence, really, and also one thing that hasn't really been brought up that has been mentioned in these surveys is the slow and creeping obsession with things like ChatGPT becoming a surrogate companion.
Yeah.
People spend their entire lives talking to AI now, pouring out their feelings and entering this weird realm of delusion that can send people genuinely mad.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see a lot more of that in sort of lone wolf violence cases going forward.
Yeah, the day I find conversation with an artificial machine is the day you need to come and take me away, Connor. Stick me in a nice home somewhere for the bewildered. Always good to have you on, Connor Tomlinson. Thank you, writer at Courage Media. It's interesting, the Adolescence thing, which sort of went mad. I can't be the only person that watched it, and clearly there's some obvious, incredible acting in it, and the way it's filmed, and it's incredibly powerful. I didn't, maybe it's an age demographic thing, I didn't watch Adolescence as if I was watching a drama predicated on the theme of boys getting radicalised online. That was at the beginning. You found out why he might have done it. The rest of it was about a family that was being destroyed and falling apart, and the relationship with their son because he'd been accused of a murder. It was almost, I'd kind of almost forgotten what was meant to be behind the murder. It never dominated the theme. I thought all the power and the writing and the acting that was amazing from it came about a family in meltdown. I can't be the only person that watched it through that prism, rather than the constant thought that this is what happens when boys go online and go to the wrong places. There was a couple of scenes that alluded to that, but that wasn't the thing I felt that motivated it along as a piece of drama. Back to your calls. Peter is in Sussex. Peter, what have you got for us? Afternoon to you.
Hello, mate. Yeah, nice to talk to you. I was just listening to your fellow caller, Dan, I think his name was, regarding the lockdowns and COVID. I've been listening to the news all day, talk radio as well, and it seems like Boris has been thrown under a bus. People with hindsight can do this so often. I remember very vividly that Boris was questioned at the briefings every day, and the mainstream media were attacking him with questions. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? But no one's questioning the sage. All the experts, in inverted commas, were telling him what to do. And no one's that judge yesterday doing her summing up Did she ever say about Ferguson, who was caught bed hopping during lockdown, and he's the one that told Boris Johnson, if you don't do this, 500,000 people would die. But no one's questioning him or the other two that used to stand either side of Boris at the lecterns, and they're getting away scot-free.
Yeah.
You know, I understand, you know, of course he made mistakes. No, it's unprecedented. But no one's using that word as though it's COVID. We should know exactly what to do.
Yeah.
And then, if you remember, really, Starmer from the sidelines attacking Boris every day. Lockdown. We want more lockdowns. Why aren't you doing this? Oh, we've already done that. Oh, yeah, I want more. And, you know, Boris is not the only one. Okay, he was the Prime Minister, but you're forgetting he nearly died in the early part of 2020.
Yeah.
You know, when COVID struck. And of course he's going to make mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, I think it was... the story is, you know, we're all looking for one headline, aren't we, really? We're all looking to go, right, this is what went wrong. And we can walk away and go to the pub tonight and go, you know, did you hear what went wrong? Oh, it was this. And, of course, it's not that. It's not that. There's like 200 things that went wrong and 2,000 people involved in those 200 things.
A little added thing. My wife's a nurse. She works at Eastbourne Hospital. She's a phlebotomist. She takes blood, and she's been taking COVID people from wards. And she was working right through COVID.
Mm-hmm.
She actually got COVID and gave it to me, would you believe? But it seemed to sidestep my son. But there you go. But yeah, I mean, every day she used to say to me, "Where's all this PPE shortage?" There was no PPE shortage. There was a lot of wastage. PPE.
Well, that's why they panicked. I mean, this idea, they talk about giving contracts to their mates, and I don't even think it was that. I think that's a very easy way to go. You know, half of these ministers didn't have mates like that. They wouldn't know these kind of characters because they don't mix in the same circles. They gave it to people who they thought was the quickest way to deal with it. Again, it was panic, it was ineptitude, it was stupid, dumb and bloody expensive. And that's another tangent to this as well. The amount of money spent in that area, which, as you rightly say, was absolutely flipping vast. Listen, Peter, I've got to move. But you've been great. Nice to talk as well. Peter in Sussex, 0344 499 1000. It's 10 to 4. This is Talk. Big news coming this December. Our talkTV app is moving to the Talk app. You can watch, catch up and listen to all your favourite shows and podcasts anytime, anywhere, all on the Talk app. From Monday, 1st of December, the talkTV app will no longer exist, so don't miss out. So head over to your App Store or Google Play and search Talk now.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on your mobile, and on your side. This is Talk.
This is Talk. Trish says, I told ChatGTP that I was off skinny dipping and it told me to be careful and not get caught. You see, you can have conversation. I remember taking a really sad call years ago when I was on TalkSport. So this would have been like, 11 o'clock at night. And somebody called and said that they were talking to Alexa. They sometimes spoke to Alexa because that was the only voice they heard. To hear another voice. And this is way before the whole, AI stuff was really kicking in. Betty says, with the NEET programme and NI changes and union control of apprenticeships, this is the real reason why kids are unemployed. There's probably something in that as well. Andrew's in Hertfordshire. What have you got for us, Andrew? Afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. As we both know, he's certainly going to do the local elections, but he's going to be gone soon. I owe you lunch. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, but the point is, it's whether it leads to a general election, Andrew. That's my interest.
Yeah, and I think it has to, because the only way he's going to be scuppered by the fact they're all left wing. They're going to be tanking in the polls, and he will have to have the support of Jeremy Corbyn, and he will go to the polls, and whoever's the leader of the Labour Party will invite Corbyn back in to go to the polls. That's what will get the Labour vote again. Now, in relation to Boris, it's very straightforward. Everybody hated Boris, not you, but in the media because of Brexit. He got in position of power, and then COVID struck. No one talks about China. The responsibility for COVID is with China. These people that are in charge, Hancock, him, and others, they did their best. The civil service was supposed to have in place a plan that the politicians just enacted. There was nothing.
Yep.
So the real people that didn't support the population and caused the deaths is the civil service. But the root cause of it is China. And we're about to give them an embassy in the middle of the city of London.
How have China... I mean, what's happened about that? I mean, is there an inquiry into the Chinese element to this? Does this Baroness's next phase get anywhere near... I mean, I think the fella that used to run the World Health Organisation, didn't he congratulate China on how well they dealt with it? Thinking, well, hang on, whether it came from a laboratory or whether it came from a manky bat in a wet market, either way, it came from China, right? I mean, surely is there not a price to pay for that?
You would think so, but remember, if you think about it, Tiananmen Square didn't happen. China... It's all about the individual doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The Communist Party does.
Yeah,
so
you could knock on doors in China and people would never have heard of Tiananmen Square. I get it. Andrew, I've got to move, but thank you for that. And Kaz says, I was worried with I think this might be reference a previous call. I've only got this part of the message come through. I was worried about, this was about visiting parents or sick people in hospital. And what was written on the death certificate. I wanted to make sure my mum's death certificate read that when she passed with cancer, not COVID, when she was in hospital, I had to phone the ward to get a code so I could visit her, but only for 10 minutes at a time. This is terrible. The day she passed, I couldn't visit the ward. The ward was on lockdown due to a highly contagious patient. I had to wait until they got the all clear before I could start the process of dealing with everything that goes with a passing. It's been 4 years, but every now and again, it catches me. And that really gets to the heart of it, of all the stories around COVID and the lockdown. This idea, and Kevin O'Sullivan's with us, of people who couldn't visit a sick parent, Kev. I mean, that really crystallises the horror of what people were put through.
Yeah, it really, I mean, looking back on those really dark days, how extraordinary they were, most annoying thing about this ridiculous COVID inquiry is costing us about £180,000 every day, £200 million spaffed so far, is that they've obviously spent time, Baroness Hallett, deliberating on whether or not Boris and his gormless gang were woke enough. Condemning the toxic language and the misogynistic language allegedly of Dominic Cummings. I didn't realise that was part of the inquiry. What were the Downing Street team woke?
What is it? An HR inquiry or a COVID inquiry?
And did you notice that she's like, the England, the awful Tory Westminster government